They wore crowns, swore oaths, and ruled empires. Yet, behind the velvet curtains, their bedrooms were war zones, negotiation tables, and theatres of betrayal. These aren't your sanitized textbook monarchs. These are the scandals they tried to burn, bury, and rewrite. From secret marriages to royal mistresses turned political weapons, this is 2 hours of whispered affairs, forbidden love, and dynasties undone by desire. Welcome to 49 royal sex scandals they tried to erase from history. Because if you think power corrupts, wait until you see what it does behind closed doors. Before we dive headfirst into royal chaos, make sure you're subscribed. This channel is your passport to the strangest corners of history they hoped you'd never find. And while you're here, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country and the time on the clock down in the comments. Let's see who's up late, uncovering royal secrets with us. The Tour de Nesle affair, 1314. It began with a tower. A hulking, stony thing squatting on the banks of the Seine. The Tour de Nesle wasn't especially notable until, of course, it became the centre of the most humiliating royal sex scandal medieval France had ever seen. The kind of story that crackles with betrayal, imprisonment, whispers and confessionals, and of course, a healthy dose of dynastic collapse. 3 daughters-in-law of King Philippe IV of France were accused of adultery, but not just any adultery, oh no. Margaret and Blanche of Burgundy, married to the future Louis X and Charles IV, allegedly took lovers in the form of 2 brothers, Philippe and Gauthier d'Aulnay, minor knights with reportedly major charms. The 3rd daughter-in-law, Jeanne, managed to wriggle out of the worst of it, but the scandal didn't leave her unscathed either. According to some accounts, the women would meet their lovers in that very tower, the Tour de Nesle, where secrecy was guaranteed by thick walls and thicker bribes. The brothers were said to have flaunted the affair with damning recklessness, wearing gifts from the princesses, boasting in taverns, showing off silk purses like they were badges of royal conquest. Not the kind of subtlety one expects when your bedmates are directly in line to the French throne. When the scandal broke through a source that may have been none other than Queen Isabella of England, sister to the accused princesses, the punishment was biblical. The Darnay brothers were arrested, tortured, and executed in a way that medieval France considered appropriately discouraging. Marguerite was imprisoned in Chateau Gaillard, where she allegedly died of cold shortly after, though the cold may have had more to do with court politics than temperature. Blanche was imprisoned for years. The real fallout, however, was genetic. Louis XI's only legitimate heir from Marguerite died young. Charles IV's marriage to Blanche never produced a child. And Jeanne, though spared punishment, was forever suspect. This cascade of infertility and scandal directly contributed to the extinction of the Capetian line, leaving a gaping dynastic vacuum that would, in time, help ignite the 100 Years' War. So, yes, a scandal involving 2 brothers and 3 princesses may have altered the course of European history, all from behind the stone walls of a tower no one had paid much attention to until they did. And if you thought France had a monopoly on royal misbehaviour, let's take a brisk walk northward to a court where medical malpractice became a political philosophy and the Queen's lover held the scalpel. Queen Caroline Matilda and Johann Friedrich Struensee, 1772. If you're the sister of the British king and you marry the King of Denmark, you'd think you'd be insulated from chaos. But then again, you'd also have to remember this is 18th century Denmark, where Enlightenment ideals clashed with mental instability, and the king's personal physician may or may not have been sleeping with his wife while also governing the entire country. Caroline Matilda, the teenage sister of George III, was married off to Christian VII of Denmark. It was a diplomatic win, a neat little alliance inked in royal blood. Unfortunately, Christian VII was not well. Historical consensus suggests he was mentally ill, possibly schizophrenic, and wholly unfit to govern. Into this royal void stepped Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German doctor with a love of Rousseau, radical reform, and, it turned out, queens. Struensee was supposed to help the king. Instead, he helped himself to the queen's confidence, to political power, and, if the gossip is to be believed, to her bed. By 1770, Struensee had essentially taken control of the Danish government. He issued hundreds of decrees, abolishing torture, reforming the legal system, even promoting freedom of the press. You know, the usual foreplay. The Danish court seethed. A foreign commoner with progressive ideas was bad enough. That he was allegedly bedding the queen made it intolerable. By 1772, a coup was in motion. Struensee was arrested, tried, and executed. His reforms were rolled back. And Caroline Matilda? She was banished, exiled to Hanover, separated from her children, and erased from Danish memory like a stain on a coronation robe. Historians still argue about the precise nature of their relationship. Were they lovers or co-conspirators with suspicious chemistry? The physical evidence was circumstantial. The political evidence damning. One thing was certain. A German doctor seduced not just a queen, but an entire nation, at least briefly, and then lost it all. Of course, if you're still not convinced that royal intimacy can collapse empires, let's turn to one of England's most debated royal pairings where the line between favouritism and forbidden love was blurry, political, and bloody. If you're still with us after Edward II and Piers Gaveston, you're exactly the kind of curious mind we built this channel for. Go ahead, hit subscribe so you don't miss what else history tried to sweep under the rug. And while you're at it, tell us where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila? 3 a.m. in Toronto? We see you, night owls. Edward II and Piers Gaveston. The problem wasn't just that Edward II had a favourite. It was that his favourite was beautiful, arrogant, insulting, and very likely the king's lover. Piers Gaveston was everything the English nobility hated. Low-born, well, noble-ish, flamboyant, and far too cosy with the king. Edward II raised him to the Earldom of Cornwall, a title normally reserved for actual royalty. He lavished him with gifts, land, and unfiltered affection. They hunted together, dined together, even wore matching clothes, according to some disapproving chroniclers who really didn't need to see it to be scandalised. The court whispered. The barons didn't whisper, they roared. Parliament eventually exiled Gaveston. Twice. Edward just kept bringing him back. The situation spiraled into something less like politics and more like a jealous high school clique with swords. Eventually, the barons had enough. In 1312, Gaveston was captured and executed illegally by a group of noblemen who saw him as a national menace. Edward never forgave them. The emotional fallout was epic, and the political consequences catastrophic. Was it love, lust, or just a deep, codependent bromance? No one can say for sure. But the sheer intensity of Edward's attachment to Gaveston and his refusal to live without him tells its own story. One that wouldn't be the king's last scandal. Spoiler, there's a Hugh dispenser coming. But we'll get there. For now, consider this. In the medieval mind, a king's bedchamber was a mirror of his kingdom. And when that mirror cracked, when power and passion blurred, the whole realm shattered with it. And speaking of broken reflections, let's talk about a prince who tried to marry for love, broke the law to do it, and ended up trapped in a legal farce involving 2 wives, 1 papal rejection, and a very scandalous ring. George IV's secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert. In royal circles, marriage is rarely about love. It's about lineage, land, and the paperwork that keeps empires stable. So when the Prince of Wales, later George IV, secretly married a Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert in 1785, it wasn't just romantic rebellion, it was political sabotage. Let's back up. At the time, British law, specifically the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, required all royals to seek the monarch's permission to Wednesday, and Maria Fitzherbert, she ticked all the boxes for what George's father, King George III, would disapprove of. She was older, she was Catholic, she was a commoner, and worst of all, she wasn't approved. George fell for her anyway. Or maybe fell isn't the right word. He chased her with a melodramatic flair only the Prince of Wales could manage. When she rebuffed him, he faked a suicide attempt, complete with bloodied theatrics, and sent her a note dripping with emotional blackmail. In December 1785, they were married in a private ceremony, secret, illegal, and utterly non-binding under English law. The marriage was, in effect, a fantasy, a symbolic union. She wore the ring, he wore the deception. Parliament knew, the king knew, the press knew, but officially, it never happened. Fast forward a few years, George, drowning in debt and desperate for funds, agreed to marry his cousin Caroline of Brunswick in exchange for Parliament paying off his staggering bills. Spoiler, he hated her on sight. They separated almost immediately after producing a single heir, Princess Charlotte. But the ghost of Maria Fitzherbert hovered over it all. Even after the legal marriage, George kept in contact with her. She remained his emotional anchor, his moral out. And after his death, she even produced documentation of the secret marriage, though the papers were swiftly locked away by royal decree. The irony? George IV, the future monarch who drank too much, dressed too flamboyantly, and treated his official wife with withering contempt, may have actually been faithful in heart, if not always in habit, to a woman the law said he couldn't love. It was the kind of scandal the monarchy couldn't entirely scrub out. A love story the crown pretended had never happened, even while its consequences shaped an entire reign. And one the royal family would revisit again and again whenever love and duty found themselves on opposite sides of the aisle. Which brings us neatly to the sequel no one asked for, the courtroom disembowelment of that very legal marriage, featuring betrayal, adultery, national spectacle, and a king trying very, very hard to pretend he'd never met his own wife. The Queen Caroline adultery trial, 1820. When George IV ascended to the throne in 1820, he had a problem. Technically, he had a queen. Caroline of Brunswick was still alive, still legally his wife, and still entirely uninterested in disappearing quietly. He had married her only under financial duress, detested her from the moment she arrived in England, and separated from her after just 1 year. But now she was back storming into London, demanding recognition as Queen Consort and threatening to turn the monarchy into a national punchline. The King's response? Drag her through the mud. Officially. In Parliament. Thus began the Pains and Penalties Bill, a proposal to strip Caroline of her title and dissolve the marriage on the grounds of adultery. It was essentially a public trial, one where every salacious rumour, every whispered affair, and every bit of gossip from her travels on the continent was paraded before the House of Lords and a scandal-hungry public. At the centre of the case was one Bartolomeo Pergami, an Italian courtier accused of being her lover. The prosecution wheeled in witnesses mostly bribed, mostly dubious, who painted Caroline as immoral, unfit, and altogether scandalous. The evidence, sketchy. The motives, transparent. But Caroline didn't back down. She walked through jeering mobs with her head high, wrote open letters, showed up at public events, and became improbably a symbol of resistance. The public, never fond of George IV to begin with, rallied behind her. The trial became a circus. Caricaturists had a field day. Pamphleteers spilled ink by the gallon. In the end, the bill passed the House of Lords by a narrow margin, but was dropped due to overwhelming public backlash. Caroline, technically, won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. She was barred from George's coronation in 1821, literally shut out at the doors of Westminster Abbey. She died just a few weeks later. George got what he wanted. A coronation without interruption. A narrative where he could play the wounded monarch. But the monarchy itself had taken a hit publicly, morally, and spiritually. A queen tried in public for scandal. By a king whose own affairs were an open secret, revealed more about royal hypocrisy than it did about virtue. And yet, if the court of George IV taught Britain one thing, it was this: royal mistresses might be unofficial, but they could still wield terrifying influence. Especially when the next king's heart and perhaps more belonged not to his wife, but to someone else entirely. Edward VII and Alice Keppel. By the time Edward VII inherited the throne in 1901, he'd been waiting for it for nearly 60 years. That's a long time to rehearse a coronation speech and a longer time to practice being scandalous. Edward, known to friends as Bertie, had spent his entire adult life defying Victorian restraint. While his mother, Queen Victoria, wept over morality and empire, Edward indulged in food, gambling, and women. Many, many women. But of them all, one stood out: Alice Keppel. She arrived on the scene in the 1892nd, charming, intelligent, married of course, and well aware of how court politics worked. Their affair was no secret. It was practically public policy. She had her own quarters when he visited aristocratic homes. She rode in his carriages. She was present at state functions. Even Queen Alexandra Edward's long-suffering wife tolerated her, likely calculating that a manageable mistress was preferable to another round of royal embarrassment. Alice played her role flawlessly. She soothed Bertie's temper, offered political insight, and kept his scandals from tipping into full-blown disaster. Unlike some of his earlier flings, she didn't push for recognition or drama. She understood that power lay in proximity, not performance. When Edward fell ill in 1910, it was Alice, not his wife, who was summoned to his bedside. She was discreetly asked to leave just before he died. The royal family, ever vigilant about optics, didn't want her name immortalized in the death narrative. But she had been there. Quietly, steadily, through the parties, the state dinners, the diplomatic tightropes. The Keppel affair was less about sex than strategy. In many ways, Alice was a soft power broker, someone who shaped policy not by decree, but by whisper. And perhaps that's why her legacy lingers. Not because she scandalized the court, but because she managed not to. Of course, dynasties love irony. So decades later, Alice Keppel's great-granddaughter Camilla Parker Bowles would reprise the role of royal mistress in the modern age. But that's another segment, because first, we have to talk about how a royal romance in 1936 brought down a crown not with a scandalous affair, but with the wrong kind of love. One that was married, American, and unacceptable to the entire British Empire. Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. There are many reasons monarchs lose their crowns: war, rebellion, incompetence. Edward VIII, he lost his throne to love, or so the story goes. In 1936, Edward became king. By December, he wasn't anymore. And the reason everyone heard, repeated, dramatized, and softened into romantic folklore was this. He wanted to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite, and the government said no. But the story behind the headlines is considerably messier. Edward had been infatuated with Wallis for years before taking the throne. She was witty, sharp, commanding, and critically, married to her second husband. Edward didn't seem to mind. He introduced her to his family, brought her to functions, and even had her photographed alongside royals in semi-official events. Subtlety was not his strong suit. The crisis exploded when Wallis filed for divorce in late 1936, and Edward made it clear he intended to marry her. This wasn't just a matter of etiquette. As King of England, Edward was also Supreme Governor of the Church of England, which at the time forbade remarriage after divorce if the former spouse was still alive, which Wallis's were, both of them. The government couldn't allow it. Parliament refused to consent. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, voiced open disapproval. For a monarch whose power was largely symbolic, symbolism mattered. And the symbol of Edward choosing a divorcee over the stability of empire sent the wrong message. So Edward gave them a different one. He abdicated. In a radio broadcast on the 11th of December, 1936, he told the nation he couldn't carry out his duties without the help and support of the woman I love. It was elegant, moving, romantic, but it was also damage control. Wallis had fled to France amid the media storm. The monarchy was in crisis mode. Edward's younger brother, George VI, was rushed into power with a stammer and a terrified sense of duty. Edward became the Duke of Windsor. He married Wallis in France in 1937. No royal family members attended. The couple lived abroad, alternating between exile and awkward diplomacy. They were photographed endlessly, sometimes glamorously, sometimes aimlessly. Some said they looked like royalty in exile. Others said they looked like actors out of work. Behind the scenes, it wasn't all silk and champagne. There were rumors of Nazi sympathies, letters intercepted by governments, tense conversations between the Windsors and palace officials. Edward thought he could return to Britain in glory one day. The crown made sure he didn't. History remembers the abdication as a grand love story, and perhaps it was. But love, in this case, cost a king his throne, his country its continuity, and the royal family its comfort zone. Of course, royal discretion didn't improve with time. Because decades later, a private phone call, an answering machine, and a scandal called Camillagate would prove that not even modern technology could save a monarch from himself. Camillagate, 1993. In the early 1992, the British monarchy looked fragile. The fairy tale of Charles and Diana had long since collapsed into tabloid ash. 3 royal marriages were publicly unraveling, and newspapers were devouring palace gossip with feral joy. But nothing, not even Diana's tell-all interviews, could quite match the surreal, intimate horror of Camillagate. The year was 1993. A transcript of a private telephone conversation between Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, recorded back in 1989, was leaked to the press. It wasn't supposed to exist. It definitely wasn't supposed to be printed. And yet, there it was, full of whispered endearments, cringe-worthy metaphors, and a level of unfiltered vulnerability that made even the most hardened Fleet Street editors wince. It was embarrassing, not because of what they said, but because of how much it revealed. 2 people, madly in love, trapped in marriages they couldn't emotionally escape. It humanized them, but in the most mortifying way possible. The press dubbed it Tampongate because British tabloids have the subtlety of a wrecking ball, and the nickname stuck. The backlash was immediate. Charles's public image, already shaky, took a nosedive. Royalists were outraged. Republicans were gleeful. And the monarchy, that institution of stiff upper lips and rigid formality, suddenly looked like it belonged in a soap opera. The transcript was read aloud in pubs, satirized on sketch shows, analyzed like a Shakespearean tragedy written by an overheated fax machine. But beneath the mockery was a more complicated truth. Charles and Camilla had been in love for decades. Their relationship had survived arranged marriages, family pressure, and relentless public scrutiny. The scandal wasn't just about sex or infidelity. It was about the grotesque consequences of a monarchy that demanded emotional repression while the world around it ran on human messiness. The royal family issued the usual statements: silence, distance, damage control. But the tape existed. The world had heard it. And while Diana was winning hearts in interviews and landmine campaigns, Charles was reduced to punchlines and leaked conversations. Years later, the scandal would fade. Charles and Camilla would marry. The public would soften. But in 1993, it felt like the institution itself had been caught in the act, stripped of its stoicism, exposed in a moment of raw, awkward humanity. And just when you thought it couldn't get more complicated, along came the other half of this royal implosion, ready to speak her truth on national television. With a bombshell that would detonate what's left of the royal facade. Princess Diana's Panorama Confession, 1995. By the time Princess Diana sat down with journalist Martin Bashir for her infamous 1995 Panorama interview, the fairy tale was long dead and everyone knew it. What they didn't know, at least not officially, was how dead. Diana didn't just open the palace curtains, she tore them down, set them on fire, and invited 23 million viewers to watch the blaze. She was poised, fragile, striking every inch the people's princess. But her words cut like a scalpel. She confirmed her affair with Army Officer James Hewitt. She spoke candidly about her mental health, the coldness of royal life, the betrayals, the isolation, and of course, that line. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. No one watching that night was left in doubt about who she meant. The interview wasn't just shocking, it was unprecedented. A royal airing marital grievances was one thing. Admitting infidelity, discussing suicidal thoughts, and accusing palace forces of systematic cruelty was something else entirely. It wasn't a scandal, it was a confession booth wired for global broadcast. The fallout was immediate. The Queen demanded a divorce. Public sympathy surged toward Diana. The royal family scrambled into PR mode. For Charles, it was another blow in a decade of them. For the monarchy, it was a full-blown existential crisis. But here's the twist. Diana's honesty, however raw and revealing, didn't destroy her. It transformed her. She became a global icon, transcending royalty, rebranding herself as a humanitarian and a martyr in real time. Her words weren't just scandalous, they were revolutionary. And still, beneath the strength, there was pain. Diana had once been the naive teenager sold into a fairy tale. Now, she was a woman weaponizing truth in a system built on silence. Panorama changed everything. For the monarchy, it marked the collapse of mystique. For Diana, it marked her rebirth as a symbol. But for all the healing it promised, the wounds were still open. Because scandal, as history keeps reminding us, doesn't end with a tearful confession. Sometimes it ends in silence, or worse, settlement. Which brings us to a prince whose friendship with a predator became the royal family's darkest, most radioactive burden. And this time, there would be no interview. Just a photo, a lawsuit, and a door that slammed shut forever. Prince Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein. It began, as these things often do, with a friendship no one wanted to look too closely at, until suddenly everyone was staring. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, was once the monarchy's action man, a war hero, a helicopter pilot, the dashing spare with tabloid-ready swagger. But by the 2010 second, the headlines had taken a darker turn. Whispers had become warnings, and the name Jeffrey Epstein had turned from New York socialite to global synonym for predator. Standing next to him, often quite literally in photos, was Andrew. The friendship went back years. They had attended parties together, been photographed strolling in Central Park, stayed at each other's homes. Epstein had even attended Princess Beatrice's 18th birthday party. When Epstein was convicted in 2008 for soliciting a minor, most of his high society friends scattered like dry leaves, but not Andrew. He stayed in touch. He even visited Epstein in New York after the conviction. When asked why, years later, his answer would be a masterclass in self-destruction. It was a convenient place to stay. Convenient, that word did a lot of heavy lifting. In 2015, Virginia Giuffre, formerly Roberts, publicly accused Andrew of abusing her while she was being trafficked by Epstein, a claim Andrew categorically denied. The royal response was silence, then statements, then a growing sense of unease. The photograph of Andrew with a young Virginia, his arm around her waist, Epstein's associate Ghislaine Maxwell smiling in the background, became an icon of a scandal no one wanted to name out loud. Then came the interview. In 2019, Prince Andrew sat down with the BBC's Newsnight, presumably to clear his name. What followed was something else entirely. A disastrous parade of deflections, robotic denials, and a now legendary claim that he couldn't have been with Virginia that night because he was at Pizza Express in Woking. It was the kind of answer that transcended scandal and entered the realm of cultural meme. If it hadn't been so tragic, it might have been comedic. The interview backfired. Completely. Overnight, Andrew went from awkward royal to international liability. Sponsors pulled out. Charities distanced themselves. The Queen, ever the institution, removed him from official duties. In 2022, Andrew settled a civil case with Giuffre in the US, no admission of guilt, just a financial resolution. But the damage was done. He became the royal family's radioactive shadow, absent from balcony appearances, birthday celebrations, and public favour. No trial, no conviction, just a stain unspoken, unresolved, undeniable. And in a monarchy built on the myth of moral authority, Andrew's scandal was a fissure in the very stone. Of course, his ex-wife was no stranger to scandal herself, and in her case, the downfall came courtesy of a toe, a telephoto lens, and a reminder that royals rarely get to misbehave in peace. Sarah, Duchess of York, 1992. Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, affectionately nicknamed Fergie, once burst into the royal scene like a red-headed hurricane of charm. She was fun, outspoken, less polished than Diana, but more relatable. The press adored her. The courtiers did not. Her marriage to Prince Andrew began in 1986 with royal fanfare and the usual Windsor optimism, but it quickly frayed. Andrew was often away first for royal duties, then for military service, and Sarah was often alone. The tabloids circled. The separation was announced in March 1992, and the press turned feral. Then came that summer. In August of that year, The Daily Mirror published front-page photographs of Sarah sunbathing topless with American financial advisor John Bryan while he sucked her toes. The pictures had been taken without consent, using a long lens, but the damage was immediate and spectacular. The British press treated it like a national collapse. Conservative columnists clutched pearls. The Queen was reportedly not amused. And it wasn't just the pictures, it was the timing. The separation had already made her vulnerable, but now, in the public eye, she had crossed an invisible line. Not just a failed marriage, but indecorous behaviour. Not just a scandal, but a symbol of a royal system fraying at its edges. Sarah's reputation nosedived. Her financial troubles mounted. The tabloids that once adored her now hunted her. She was cast out not in law, but in tone. The palace kept her at a distance. Her role shrank. The public turned her into shorthand for bad royal behaviour. Flashy, frivolous, scandal-prone. But she didn't disappear. Over the years, Sarah rebuilt through books, business ventures, media appearances. Her friendship with Princess Diana endured. Her co-parenting with Andrew remained surprisingly warm. In fact, they continued to live together for years after the divorce, an ironic footnote that baffled royal watchers. And while time softened public perception, the 1,992 photos never fully left the royal imagination. They were a reminder that the crown, for all its gilded stoicism, was increasingly vulnerable to zoom lenses, tabloid appetite, and the messy entanglements of real human lives. And speaking of messy, the Queen's younger sister wasn't exactly scandal-free either. When you're the royal rebel, the press watches everything, especially when you take a much younger lover and flee to the Caribbean. Princess Margaret and Roddy Llewellyn, 1976. Princess Margaret had always lived in the twilight between duty and defiance. As the younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, she was born into royalty, but not into power, which meant she had just enough privilege to make mistakes and just enough profile to have them dissected in the press. Her love life had long been a sore spot. Forbidden from marrying her first great love, Group Captain Peter Townsend, due to royal and religious laws, Margaret eventually settled into a stormy marriage with photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones. By the 1972, that marriage was deteriorating into public dysfunction. Enter Roddy Llewellyn. Roddy was a landscape gardener, a minor aristocrat, and most pressingly 17 years her junior. Their relationship, which began in 1973, was equal parts romantic escape and royal outrage. The press didn't hold back. When photographs emerged in 1976 showing the pair vacationing in Mustique, a private Caribbean island known for its hedonism, the headlines erupted. It wasn't just the affair, it was the optics. A royal princess, still legally married, photographed lounging with a much younger man in paradise? It confirmed every tabloid theory. Margaret was out of control, the monarchy was out of touch, and the 72nd were eating the establishment alive. The scandal contributed to the formal announcement of her separation from Armstrong Jones that same year. Their divorce was finalised in 1978, the first divorce of a senior British royal since Henry VIII. And while the palace tried to present it as a dignified transition, the damage to Margaret's reputation was palpable. But here's the thing, Margaret didn't care. Not in the performative, rebellious way, but in the exhausted, human way. She had done her duty. She had played the part. And when the spotlight got cruel, she stepped out of it. Roddy and Margaret continued to see each other for several years. He later married someone else. She withdrew from public life. The glamour faded, the scandal aged, and a new generation of royals took centre stage. But her affair with Roddy wasn't just tabloid fodder, it was a turning point. It signalled that the monarchy's ironclad rules about love, appearances, and obedience were finally starting to buckle. Slowly, painfully. And as we'll see next, even princes with no real claim to the throne could still make headlines, especially when they made it to Vegas, lost their clothes, and found themselves on every front page in the world by morning. Prince Harry's Las Vegas photo scandal, 2012. By 2012, Prince Harry had earned a reputation that was half tabloid cartoon and half genuine misfit. He was the spare, the wild card, the ginger hellraiser with a pilot's license and a soft spot for charity work. He was loved, scrutinized, and constantly underestimated. So when the third in line to the British throne flew to Las Vegas for a private weekend with friends, the public might have expected some playful misbehavior. What they got was a full-blown PR firestorm. The images that emerged showed Harry in a Las Vegas hotel suite, entirely too comfortable with being undressed in front of a camera. Cue global media eruption. The Sun, never one to blink in the face of palace disapproval, ran the images with theatrical outrage, presenting them as evidence that Harry was everything wrong with modern royalty. And the British press, stuck between the traditional reverence for the monarchy and the digital age's appetite for clickbait, couldn't look away. The official palace response was an awkward cocktail of silence, disappointment, and private matter boilerplate. Behind the scenes, it was crisis mode. Advisors scrambled, veteran courtiers winced. The Queen, reportedly, was not amused. What made this scandal so sticky wasn't just the photos, it was the symbolism. Here was a prince, trained as a soldier, raised by the most disciplined monarchy on earth, partying like an overgrown frat boy in a foreign hotel suite. The contrast was absurd. It was too much reality for a family that ran on projection. And yet, the public didn't exactly turn on him. Many saw it as typical bachelor foolishness. Others even empathized he had, after all, lost his mother young, lived under relentless press surveillance, and been raised in a world that looked like a palace but functioned more like a cage. Harry wasn't polished, but he was, strangely, relatable. Still, the scandal marked a turning point. Harry returned to royal life with tighter boundaries. He doubled down on his military role, took up more charity work, and began the long, strange walk toward his eventual departure from royal duties altogether. But the Vegas saga lingered. It became a cultural shorthand. The prince who played too hard. The monarchy that couldn't quite keep its members in line. And just across the channel, another royal was dealing with a far older, deeper scandal. One tied not to youth or cameras, but to decades of alleged infidelity and a kingdom quietly crumbling under its weight. Spain's Juan Carlos I and Corinna Larson. For much of the late 20th century, Juan Carlos I of Spain was celebrated as a national hero, the man who shepherded Spain out of dictatorship and into democracy. Crowned in 1975 after Franco's death, Juan Carlos became the symbol of a modern, forward-thinking monarchy. But by the early 2010s, that symbol began to crack. The story of Juan Carlos and Corinna Larson, later known as Corinna Wittgenstein, isn't one of a passing royal fling. It's a decades-long connection, alleged to have mixed personal intimacy with financial opacity and political embarrassment. Corinna was a Danish-German businesswoman with access to European high society and, reportedly, the king's private circle. Very private. Their relationship was never officially confirmed, but the circumstantial evidence became overwhelming. Photos surfaced, private letters were leaked, and then came the voice recording secretly taped conversations in which Corinna claimed the former king had used her to stash assets abroad, avoid taxes, and navigate complicated financial webs. Suddenly, the scandal wasn't just personal. It was political, legal, national. In 2012, the entire mess boiled over when Juan Carlos went on a lavish elephant hunting trip in Botswana, accompanied, of course, by Corinna. At a time when Spain was in the throes of financial crisis and mass unemployment, the revelation was tone-deaf at best and national betrayal at worst. Public outrage exploded. For many, it was the final straw. Juan Carlos apologized on national television, a historic move in itself. But the damage was done. In 2014, he abdicated in favor of his son, Philippe VI, in what looked very much like a forced hand. Years later, Juan Carlos would leave Spain entirely, living in self-imposed exile in the UAE as investigations swirled around him. The monarchy, under Philippe, scrambled to restore credibility, slashing the former king's allowance, distancing the institution from scandal, and launching a PR offensive of moral reform. But the shadow of Juan Carlos and Corinna never really left. In the court of public opinion, the question remained, how much does a crown weigh when it's tangled in personal loyalty and financial secrets? But Spain wasn't alone. Just up north, another royal was forced into the courtroom, not for hunting elephants, but for fathering a child he refused to acknowledge until the DNA left no room for denial. Belgium's Albert II and Delphine Boel. It had all the makings of a classic royal denial, whispers of a love child, decades of legal stonewalling, and a monarchy determined to pretend nothing was amiss. Until, of course, science got involved. Albert II of Belgium reigned from 1993 to 2013, a relatively quiet monarch in a country where political gridlock was more exciting than any palace intrigue. But behind the scenes, another drama was quietly brewing, one involving artist Delphine Boel, her mother Sybil de Celis-Longchamps, and a long-standing claim that Albert was, in fact, her biological father. For years, the story lived in the margins. Tabloids speculated. Delphine gave interviews. The palace said nothing. Albert, predictably, denied everything. When he abdicated in 2013 citing health reasons, it was hard not to see the timing as suspicious. Abdicating freed him from certain constitutional protections. It also made him more vulnerable to civil litigation. Delphine pressed forward. She wasn't asking for titles or riches, just recognition. After a long legal battle, including a dramatic court order for DNA testing, the results came in. In 2020, a Belgian court ruled definitively. Albert II was her father. It was a victory that had taken 50 years to arrive. Suddenly, the quiet, reserved former king had a very public scandal on his hands. Delphine was formally recognized, given the title of princess, and added to the royal lineage. The palace, clearly uncomfortable, issued a brief, stiff statement acknowledging the ruling, but steering well clear of apology. What made the case so extraordinary wasn't just the paternity, it was the symbolism. Belgium, a country with a famously complex political identity, now had a royal family even more tangled than its federal structure. And Delphine, a woman once dismissed as a fantasist, now carried the title of a princess she had never wanted. For a monarchy built on discretion and decorum, it was a brutal, science-backed disruption. But if Belgian royalty thought they were alone in this sort of mess, they didn't need to look far. Across the border, another European monarch was dealing with a similar issue, except this time, there wasn't just one extramarital child. There were several. And the prince in question wasn't denying it anymore. The Netherlands Prince Bernhard and his admitted children. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands was a man who loved uniforms. Military, ceremonial, tailored, decorative, it didn't matter. He collected titles the way other men collected cufflinks. husband of Queen Juliana, father of Queen Beatrix, German aristocrat turned Dutch war hero. But beneath the medals and the monarchic polish, there was a recurring royal subplot, the extramarital affair and the children that came with it. The Dutch monarchy, known for its relatively modern attitude and unpretentious charm, had long tried to keep Bernhard's extracurriculars in the realm of polite rumour, and for a while it worked. Bernhard had charisma, an image burnished by his role in the Dutch resistance during World War II, and a penchant for cutting international deals. But even charm has its limits. In 2004, just before his death, Bernhard admitted in a letter made public posthumously that he had fathered not one, but 2 daughters outside his marriage. Their names? Alicia de Bielefeld and Alexia Levenstein. The news was not a complete surprise to those in royal watching circles, but the confirmation shattered the decades-old illusion of royal marital decorum. For years, Bernhard had danced around the truth, denying paternity while maintaining relationships that were suspiciously paternal. What made the confession so striking wasn't just the timing, it was the tone. There was no grand apology, no teary statement, just a letter, composed with aristocratic restraint, acknowledging that yes, he had fathered these children, and no, he did not believe they should have titles or be incorporated into the royal line. Recognition without responsibility. Admission without atonement. The Dutch press, ever more respectful than their British counterparts, treated the story with a mix of curiosity and cultural fatigue. Royal misbehaviour had, by this point, become more expected than scandalous, but the public reaction was more complex. Bernhard had long been viewed as both a statesman and a scoundrel. This simply confirmed which side had won. Queen Juliana, notably, had never divorced him. Theirs was a marriage of resilience, not romance. Rumours had swirled for decades about his affairs, his financial dealings, and even his involvement in a bribery scandal, the Lockheed affair, that nearly forced his resignation from public duties. Through it all, Juliana endured, or perhaps simply chose not to engage. And yet, Bernhard's posthumous confession didn't topple the Dutch monarchy. If anything, it underscored its strange immunity. The scandal was absorbed, digested, and added to the growing archive of royal imperfection. Life and the House of Orange moved on. But while Bernhard's legacy was privately unravelled, another prince in another glittering microstate was about to take a different route. He would publicly acknowledge his children born out of wedlock before anyone could scandalise it for him. Monaco's Prince Albert II and his children born out of wedlock. If there's one royal household that practically glows with cinematic intrigue, it's Monaco. A postage stamp-sized paradise on the Mediterranean coast, the principality has always punched above its weight in terms of scandal. Princess Grace, Formula One, casino royalty. It's not a country, it's a movie set with diplomatic immunity. Enter Prince Albert II, son of Prince Rainier III and Grace Kelly. A man born of a fairy tale marriage and burdened with a dynasty that demanded perfection, spectacle, and perpetual composure. So when rumours began swirling in the early 2002 that Albert had fathered children out of wedlock, the story practically wrote itself. There were 2 children at the centre of the media firestorm. Jasmine Grace Grimaldi, born in 1992 to an American mother, and Alexandra Grimaldi Coste, born in 2003 to a Togolese French flight attendant. Neither was publicly acknowledged at first. The palace maintained a tight grip on image, and Albert, long considered one of Europe's most eligible bachelors, kept his private life exceptionally private. But pressure mounted. The press closed in. Allegations hardened into legal petitions. And in 2005, shortly after the death of his father and just before his formal accession as sovereign prince, Albert issued statements confirming both children's paternity. It was, by royal standards, unprecedented. To be clear, neither child was given a claim to the throne. Monegasque law requires royal children to be born within a legal marriage in order to be eligible for succession. But Albert went further than most royals ever would. He provided financial support, maintained private relationships with both children, and crucially named them publicly. No cover-ups, no denials, no last-minute deathbed letters, just a controlled, if awkward, acceptance. The reaction in Monaco? Mixed. Some admired the honesty. Others wrinkled their brows at the timing, seeing it as a rushed clean-up before the formal coronation. Internationally, the story made headlines, mostly because it was so rare to see a royal handling a personal scandal like a rational adult. Then came the marriage. In 2011, Albert married Charlene Whitstock, a South African swimmer. Their wedding was supposed to be a reset, a glittering PR spectacle to rebrand the principality for a new era. But even that was touched by rumour. Charlene was alleged to have attempted to flee Monaco days before the ceremony, amid whispered revelations of more children. The palace, naturally, denied everything. And yet, the air remained tense. Albert and Charlene now have twins, heirs born within wedlock, theoretically ending the succession question. But the cloud lingers. Monaco is not a kingdom that forgets easily, and the Grimaldi reputation, already a blend of Hollywood glam and dynastic weirdness, remains gloriously tarnished. But if you thought Monaco held the crown for royal slander, allow us to introduce the most enduring lie in European history: a woman, an empress, and a rumour so grotesque it survived for centuries. Even though it was never true. Catherine the Great and the horse smear. There are many ways to assassinate a monarch: sword, poison, revolution. But none are as enduring or as absurd as rumour. Catherine II of Russia, known to history as Catherine the Great, was one of the most formidable rulers Europe ever produced. She expanded the empire, reformed the administration, corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers, and reigned for 34 years with iron will and political brilliance. But if you mention her name to someone who paid only partial attention in school, the response is often not educational reform or territorial expansion. It's the horse. Let's be clear from the outset. The rumour that Catherine died while engaged in an act involving a horse is 100% false, fabricated, fantastical, anatomically improbable, and logistically deranged. And yet, here we are, still talking about it centuries later. Why? Because the smear was never really about Catherine. It was about power. As a female ruler in a patriarchal world, Catherine had to navigate not just wars and treaties, but constant suspicion about her legitimacy. She came to power in 1762 after a coup against her husband, Peter III, a feeble emperor with a toy soldier obsession and a serious lack of supporters. The coup succeeded. Peter died shortly after. Catherine ruled. But not everyone appreciated being ruled by a woman, particularly one who was intelligent, sexually independent, and unapologetically in control. Her series of lovers, some political, some personal, became fodder for court gossip and diplomatic jabs. Her enemies couldn't outgovern her, so they tried to outshame her. The horse rumour likely emerged in the early 19th century, long after Catherine's death, as part of a broader tradition of sexually humiliating female rulers in history. It was outrageous enough to stick, scandalous enough to spread, and grotesque enough to outlive truth. Historians have spent decades swatting it down, but it persists, peddled in fringe books, whispered in bars, misremembered in classrooms. It's the oldest trick in the book. If you can't destroy her legacy, tarnish her body. But Catherine, ironically, has the last laugh. Her reign remains one of the most successful in Russian history. She modernized the empire, played European diplomacy like a piano, and left a legacy far too vast to be eclipsed by gossip. And yet, this single lie, so specific, so lurid, survives in the cultural bloodstream. Proof that scandal, however false, can sometimes outrun fact. And speaking of imperial affairs that actually did happen, let's step into the opulent, scandal-soaked world of the Russian ballet, where the last Tsar of Russia was captivated not by revolution or war, but by a ballerina with just enough political gravity to tip the balance of his empire's final days. Nicholas II and Mathilde Kshessinska. Before Nicholas II was the last Tsar of Russia, before the revolution and the firing squads, before the Romanovs became the ghosts of palaces turned museums, he was just a young crown prince. And like many royals before him, he fell in love with a woman the empire would never permit him to marry. Her name was Mathilde Kshessinska, a celebrated prima ballerina of the Imperial Russian Ballet. Gifted, confident, and, crucially, well-positioned within St. Petersburg's most elite circles, she dazzled the aristocracy and courted powerful admirers. She wasn't merely dancing for the Tsar, she was dancing for the whole court, and they adored her for it. But it was the young Tsarevich Nicholas who adored her most. Their relationship, never officially acknowledged but heavily implied through memoirs, letters, and contemporary gossip, began in the 1892 and continued until Nicholas's marriage to Princess Alix of Hesse, later Tsarina Alexandra. By the time he took the throne, Mathilde was no longer part of his life, but she remained very much part of his world. And she knew it. After Nicholas married, Mathilde entered into another high-ranking affair, this time with Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich, and bore a child, whose paternity became one of the court's more delicately ignored questions. Was it Nicholas's, Sergei's, another Romanov's? The ballet didn't answer questions like that. Mathilde maintained her wealth and social standing throughout the twilight of the empire, living in an opulent mansion filled with priceless gifts from admirers. She was not just tolerated, she was protected, in the vague and unspoken way that powerful men protect those with secrets. The revolution changed everything. As Bolshevik forces closed in on St. Petersburg, Mathilde fled Russia. She resettled in Paris, where she opened a ballet school and lived out her remaining years in relative obscurity, albeit with enough diamonds in her suitcase to raise a few French eyebrows. To this day, Mathilde remains a cultural riddle. Was she a manipulator, using her beauty and charm to secure power? Or was she simply a woman playing the only game the empire allowed her to play? And Nicholas? He became a tragic figure, idealistic, indecisive, and completely unprepared for the 20th century. But before the weight of history crashed down on him, he was just a young man in love with a ballerina. And in that brief moment, Russia still danced. Which brings us to another court scandal involving royalty, romance, and just a dash of the occult. Because if you thought the ballet was dramatic, wait until you hear about the love magic allegedly used in the palace of Louis XIV. Louis XIV and Madame de Montespan. Louis XIV, the Sun King, didn't just rule France, he was France. Versailles was his stage, the court, his audience, and his personal life, a daily drama of opulence, hierarchy, and thinly veiled competition. Amid the jeweled chaos of mistresses, dukes, and dancers, one woman burned brighter than all the rest, Madame de Montespan. Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemart. Yes, that was her full name. Because in 17th century, France names came with their own gravity, was not just beautiful. She was sharp, ambitious, and fearless. She entered court as a lady-in-waiting, but quickly ascended to the role of Louis's maîtresse en titre, an unofficial but deeply powerful position that made her, for a time, the most influential woman in France. They had 7 children together. She moved into apartments next to his. She even exerted political influence, acting as a kind of whispering consigliere to the Sun King himself. But power, especially in a court as theatrical as Versailles, breeds enemies. And in Montespan's case, her enemies had creative accusations. Enter the affair of the poisons, a sweeping investigation in the late 1672 into a criminal underworld of fortune-tellers, alchemists, and self-proclaimed witches. Several of these figures, under torture or eager to avoid execution, claimed Montespan had purchased love potions and participated in black masses to retain the king's affection. Yes, black masses, conducted over the bodies of infants, according to the more fevered testimonies, though no credible evidence ever surfaced. Montespan was never tried, never charged, but the stain stuck. She was quietly removed from the king's affections and replaced by a new favourite, Madame de Maintenon, who offered piety over passion. Montespan faded into religious retreat, living out her days in relative obscurity while her children rose in the ranks of French nobility. The court never officially acknowledged her fall. Versailles, as always, looked the other way. But the implications of the scandal were profound. The king's divine image had been threatened not by war or rebellion, but by the suggestion that love itself could be manipulated with ritual and blood. Montespan became a cautionary tale. What happens when ambition, desire, and power mix too freely in a gilded palace? And speaking of gilded palaces and questionable decisions, Louis's great-grandson would take the scandal baton and sprint even further with it, building a secret pleasure palace and appointing a teenage courtesan as his official mistress, Louis XV and Madame du Barry. If Louis XIV was the blazing Sun King, then Louis XV was the fading embers of a monarchy, too busy feasting to notice the house was on fire. By the time he took the throne, the crown had become more decorative than divine, and Louis XV seemed content to treat it accordingly. His reign was filled with contradictions, military blunders, political drift, and behind it all, a dizzying carousel of mistresses. But none were more controversial or more symbolic than Jeanne Bécu, later known as Madame du Barry. Born the illegitimate daughter of a seamstress, Jeanne had none of the pedigree required to become a royal consort. What she did have, however, was beauty, charisma, and the unflinching support of a noble patron who orchestrated her rise. She was carefully married to a low-ranking noble just long enough to qualify her for court, and then introduced to Louis XV. The king, deep into his 60s and drifting further from political responsibility, was enchanted. Jeanne was witty and affectionate, and he elevated her to the role of official mistress. Court society erupted. She wasn't just common, she was vulgar. She was everything Versailles pretended not to be. The aristocracy recoiled. Madame du Barry became the lightning rod for every resentment in the kingdom, a symbol of royal decadence, favoritism, and the widening gap between monarch and people. Satirical pamphlets circulated, scathing letters were passed hand to hand in salons. Even Marie Antoinette, then a teenage dauphine, famously refused to speak to her. Louis XV didn't care. He built her apartments at Versailles. He gifted her jewels, estates, even an artificial village for her amusement. But the excess couldn't hide the rot. As the country slid toward revolution, du Barry became one more emblem of a monarchy that had lost touch with reality. After Louis XV's death, du Barry was exiled from court. She later returned to Paris and, in a final twist of fate, was arrested during the French Revolution. Her pleas for mercy were ignored. She was executed in 1793, her lavish life reduced to a cautionary footnote. Her story is less about seduction than survival, about how far someone can rise on charm alone, and how quickly that charm curdles when the world demands accountability. And the next scandal would be no less tragic. A royal prince, a dead mistress, and a scandalous suicide pact, or was it murder, in a locked lodge in the Vienna woods. The Meerling Tragedy, 1889. On the morning of the 30th of January, 1889, the bodies of Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria and his 7-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera, were discovered in the Imperial Hunting Lodge at Meerling. The scandal wasn't just in the deaths, it was in the cover-up that followed. The tragedy was immediately swaddled in imperial silence, then wrapped in lies, then launched into history as one of the most enduring royal mysteries ever recorded. Rudolf was the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth, heir to the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire. Sensitive, liberal-minded, and chronically at odds with his father's militaristic conservatism, Rudolf was an awkward fit for the Habsburg machinery. He chafed under court rules. He drank heavily. His marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium was strained and joyless. His political ideals, inspired by Enlightenment writers, were viewed as radical in a court that still thought 1789 had been a clerical error. Then came Mary Vetsera, young, beautiful, and infatuated with the idea of romantic martyrdom. She became Rudolf's emotional confidant, and, eventually, his lover. The relationship was considered improper, though not unusual by aristocratic standards until Meierling, until the morning when they were both found dead. What happened that night has been debated endlessly. The official narrative was a murder-suicide. Rudolf, despondent over his life, shot Mary and then himself. But that account was hastily cobbled together, inconsistent, and riddled with contradictions. The court first claimed Rudolf died of a heart attack, then changed it again. Mary's body was buried in secret. Her farewell letters vanished into imperial archives for decades. Why the secrecy? Because this wasn't just a scandal, it was a constitutional crisis. Rudolf's death left the empire without a clear successor. Worse, the nature of his death threatened the moral authority of the Habsburgs. How could a man anointed by God for future rule have committed such an act? The church had to be persuaded to allow a Christian burial, which involved framing Rudolf's actions as the result of temporary insanity. Convenient theology. The aftermath reshaped European politics. With Rudolf gone, the succession passed to Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Yes, that Franz Ferdinand whose assassination in 1914 would light the match for World War I. The death of a crown prince and his teenage mistress became not just a tabloid scandal, but a hinge moment in modern history. And while Meerling remains unsolved, what it revealed about monarchy was clear. Behind the grandeur and ceremony, there were broken hearts, failed dreams, and a desperation no title could cure. And speaking of desperation, let's talk about another Leopold, this time in Belgium, whose affair with a teenage mistress played out not in a hunting lodge, but against the backdrop of colonial terror. Leopold II and Caroline Lacroix. Leopold II of Belgium is remembered less for his domestic reign than for the nightmare he unleashed in the Congo, a privately owned colony he governed with unspeakable brutality. But while history books now account for the atrocities committed under his rule, there's another layer to his story that's equally scandalous, albeit far less bloody. His long affair with a teenager named Caroline Lacroix. Caroline was a Parisian prostitute when she met the aging monarch. He was in his late 60s. She was barely 16. He fell for her instantly. For him, she was a balm. For her, he was a golden goose. Their relationship became an open secret, with Caroline receiving titles, diamonds, estates, and eventually, even a castle. Leopold wasn't subtle, he flaunted her like a prized possession. And that's where things got awkward, because while Leopold was parading Caroline through European society, Belgium was still technically a constitutional monarchy with a conservative Catholic public. The idea of the king maintaining a public relationship with a teenage mistress, not to mention showering her with colonial blood money, sparked national disgust. They called her La Reine du Congo. It wasn't a compliment. Leopold's obsession with Caroline coincided with the height of his wealth extraction from the Congo Free State. Rubber profits flowed in, and a good deal of it flowed straight to her. Belgian taxpayers were outraged, not just by the moral indecency, but by the economics. This was corruption cloaked in pearls. In 1909, just before his death, Leopold tried to secure her financial future by transferring massive fortunes and property to her name. The Belgian government intervened, successfully challenging many of the gifts and forcing her to return parts of the inheritance. It was one of the few times the state said no to the king, and perhaps the only time it did so out of genuine moral exasperation. After Leopold's death, Caroline lived lavishly in France. She married a baron, published memoirs, and clung to the shadow of royalty she'd once inhabited. Her version of events, that she had been his great love, historians tend to take a colder view. She was a symptom of his excess, not a cure for it. Leopold's legacy is now one of mass exploitation, racial violence, and a kind of grotesque royal indulgence that tainted the Belgian monarchy for decades. Caroline, in that context, was both accomplice and beneficiary. The scandal was never just about the affair. It was about what the affair revealed. A man detached from morality, ruling a kingdom like a private fiefdom, and elevating his own pleasure above a continent's suffering. And speaking of royal men whose private pleasures were anything but private, let's turn back the clock way back to a king of England whose most legendary mistress is still remembered in poetry, painting, and whispered stories of secret towers. Henry II and Fair Rosamond Clifford. Henry II of England was many things: administrator, conqueror, legal innovator, and occasional source of exasperation to Thomas Becket. But among all his legacies, one scandal shines with particular Gothic allure: his romance with Rosamond Clifford, better known to posterity as Fair Rosamond. Rosamond was the daughter of a minor lord, noted for her beauty, and according to court lore, her discretion. She caught the king's eye sometime during his increasingly strained marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most formidable queens in European history. The affair, though unconfirmed in court records, lives on in centuries of folklore, scandal ballads, and lurid retellings. According to legend, Henry installed Rosamond in a secret bower, a labyrinthine palace at Woodstock, accessible only by a maze so complex that only he could find her. Romantic? Perhaps. Creepy? Definitely. Whether the maze ever existed is up for debate. What isn't debated is that Rosamond became the subject of whispered envy and political anxiety. Mistresses were common. Secret palaces? Less so. Eleanor, for her part, was not amused. Though the details are almost certainly apocryphal, medieval chroniclers insisted that the queen eventually discovered the affair, penetrated the maze, and offered Rosamond a choice between poison and a dagger. The story reads like a morality play: queenly wrath, feminine rivalry, tragic beauty. It's also almost certainly fiction. But like all good royal myths, it stuck. Rosamond eventually retired to a nunnery, or was sent there and died young. Henry continued his reign, increasingly defined by battles with his sons and church officials, with Rosamond receding into romantic myth. She was buried at Godstow Abbey, where her tomb became a minor pilgrimage site until it was desecrated during the Reformation. The real scandal, in retrospect, wasn't that Henry had a mistress. It was how much the public seemed to need the story of Rosamond, the tragic beauty, the cruel queen, the doomed love. It offered an emotional counterweight to the brutal realpolitik of Henry's court. And speaking of doomed royal women, the next queen we meet married her third husband just weeks after her second was murdered, by whom no one could say for sure, not even her. Mary, Queen of Scots, and the Earl of Bothwell. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, knew drama like most people know breathing. From infancy, her life unfolded like a tragic opera: betrayal, ambition, imprisonment, and enough dead husbands to make even Shakespeare raise an eyebrow. But among all the courtly conspiracies and Protestant power struggles, none captured the scandal sheets quite like her marriage to James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. The problem wasn't just that Mary married him. It was how quickly she did it, and the not-so-little fact that her previous husband, Lord Darnley, had been murdered under circumstances so suspicious that the phrase royal scandal feels almost polite. Let's rewind. Mary's marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, had been a political miscalculation from day one. He was arrogant, erratic, and more interested in titles than diplomacy. By the time their son James, the future James VI, and I was born, the marriage was little more than a Cold War staged in castles. In February 1567, Darnley was found dead, strangled, possibly suffocated after the house he was staying in mysteriously exploded. Subtle, it was not. Enter Bothwell. A powerful noble with a reputation for strength and suspicion, he was one of the many investigated for Darnley's murder. The charges didn't stick, possibly because the trial lasted only 7 hours and no witnesses were called. Within weeks, Bothwell had allegedly abducted Mary. Whether it was a real kidnapping or a theatrical ploy remains debated, and within 3 months of Darnley's death, they were married. Scotland erupted. The Protestant lords revolted. Nobles who had once supported Mary turned against her. The marriage was seen not only as indecently hasty but politically suicidal. Bothwell, once her protector, was now branded her puppet master, or worse, her co-conspirator. The public narrative painted Mary as either a calculating seductress or a tragically weak woman led astray. Either way, her credibility as monarch disintegrated. Mary was forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son and fled to England, seeking protection from her cousin, Elizabeth I. That didn't go as planned. Elizabeth saw her as both a political threat and a cautionary tale, and Mary would spend the next 19 years in varying states of imprisonment until her execution in 1587. The Bothwell scandal was the hinge on which Mary's fate turned. Whatever the truth, whether she loved him, feared him, or simply saw no other choice, the marriage transformed her from queen to exile, from sovereign to suspect. And while Mary's downfall unfolded in bleak castles and political chambers, the next scandalous royal lived in silk-draped decadence, flamboyant, fabulous, and flagrantly unconcerned with the gendered expectations of the Sun King's court. Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, and the Chevalier de Lorraine. In the grand theatre of Louis XIV's France, where powdered wigs and polished manners masked endless layers of scheming, few courtiers played their part with more theatrical flair than Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, known for being both the king's younger brother and Versailles' most glittering contrarian. Philippe, known familiarly as Monsieur, was everything the king wasn't: openly effeminate, fond of lace, warily tolerated by the nobility, and unashamed of his string of male lovers. Chief among them was the Chevalier de Lorraine, a man whose charm was matched only by his ability to aggravate everyone around him. The court didn't have to speculate. The relationship was neither quiet nor subtle. Lorraine's influence over Philippe was so notorious that even the king's endless tolerance for family eccentricities began to fray. Lorraine was arrogant, meddling, and treated Versailles as his playground and Philippe as his prize. To be clear, homosexuality at the time was not just frowned upon, it was criminal, but rank excused much, and Philippe's proximity to power offered him protection. Even so, scandal simmered just beneath the surface. Lorraine was accused of manipulating Philippe, sabotaging his arranged marriages, and attempting to influence court appointments through pillow talk and veiled threats. Philippe, meanwhile, seemed completely uninterested in royal discretion. He openly mocked military protocol, adorned himself in jewels, and once wore a pearl necklace to battle. He married twice, produced legitimate heirs, and then returned unapologetically to his private court of beautiful men. His first wife, Princess Henrietta of England, reportedly died in suspicious circumstances. Whispers of poison followed Philippe and Lorraine for years, though nothing was proven. His second wife, Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate, wrote letters so detailed and candid that historians still mine them like gold veins for the daily gossip of Versailles. Her descriptions of Philippe's affairs and Lorraine's interference in their marriage painted a picture of royal domestic life that was anything but royal or domestic. Yet Philippe's eccentricities never quite toppled him. In fact, he remained one of the most politically stable figures in the royal family. His children married well. His military leadership was competent, if occasionally reluctant, and despite or perhaps because of his nonconformity, he carved out a niche in Louis XIV's meticulously ordered universe. The scandal lay not just in his sexuality, but in the freedom with which he wielded it. He refused to be ashamed. In a court built on hypocrisy, that might have been the most scandalous act of all. But for the next royal in our long descent, the shame came not from openness, but from state-level paranoia, blackmail, and a decades-long national cover-up. Welcome to Sweden, and the affair that nearly erased a king. The Hajby affair, 1932nd, 1952nd. Modern monarchies often pride themselves on transparency, restraint, and the ability to evolve with the times. But in mid-20th century Sweden, when rumours surfaced that King Gustaf V had engaged in a long-running affair with a man named Kurt Hajby, the state didn't evolve. It panicked. The Hajby affair began as a murmur, a whisper in the Stockholm elite that Kurt Hajby, a convicted petty criminal and former restaurateur, had developed an intimate relationship with the aging monarch. The details were fuzzy, the timeline murky, but by the early 1932nd, something odd was definitely happening. Hajby received unusually large financial payouts from the royal court. He was imprisoned under suspect circumstances. His wife, suspicious of the payments and the secrecy, filed complaints. And then, quietly, the state intervened not to investigate, but to silence. Records show that the Swedish government spent years attempting to bury the scandal. Hajby was subjected to forced confinement in mental institutions. He was paid off repeatedly, only to resurface again with new threats, new memoir drafts, and fresh lawsuits. The pattern was clear: suppress, discredit, isolate. The court's terror wasn't just about scandal, it was about what the scandal represented. Sweden, a relatively progressive and neutral nation, feared a royal sex scandal involving a same-sex relationship would undermine the monarchy's legitimacy, particularly as fascist movements rose in neighbouring countries. But the more they tried to silence Hajby, the louder the affair became. Eventually, in the 1952nd, the case went public. Hajby published parts of his memoirs. Journalists investigated, The Swedish public was stunned not just by the nature of the allegations, but by the sheer effort the state had made to protect the monarchy at all costs. It was a slow-motion collapse of royal credibility. Gustaf V died in 1950, never publicly acknowledging the affair. Hijby, disgraced and isolated, died in 1965. He left behind a stack of court documents, letters, and stories too outlandish for fiction and too persistent for denial. The Hijby affair is less about whether a king had a lover, it's about how a modern nation twisted itself into knots to deny the possibility, and how silence, once weaponized, becomes a scandal in itself. But Sweden wasn't done with royal embarrassment just yet, because in the 21st century, another king would face a firestorm of scandal, this time involving strip clubs, secret affairs, and a book no one wanted published. Sweden's Carl XVI, Gustaf, and the 2010 scandal. In 2010, the Swedish monarchy found itself rocked by a scandal so modern, it came with footnotes, club receipts, and blackmail threats. King Carl XVI Gustaf, previously seen as a quiet, slightly awkward constitutional monarch with a fondness for vintage cars and silence, suddenly found himself the unwilling star of a tabloid exposé. The source? A bombshell book titled The Reluctant Monarch, Den Village Monarchen, a quasi-biography released with impeccable timing and a hunger for headlines. Within its pages were allegations that the king had attended exclusive strip clubs, carried on with several mistresses, and consorted with organized crime figures who helped cover it all up. The palace, taken by surprise, issued the royal equivalent of a shrug. Carl Gustaf denied the claims, kind of saying only that he and his family have turned the page. But the Swedish public wasn't so quick to move on. Sweden, after all, prides itself on transparency, equality, and modern governance. A monarchy steeped in alleged backroom dealings, secret nightlife, and hush-money envelopes did not align with the IKEA flat-pack values of the nation. The king's personal image, a mix of Scandinavian dad energy and royal restraint, suddenly seemed paper-thin. Worse, the people involved in the allegations weren't simply tabloid fantasies. They included known underworld figures and celebrities who later confirmed bits and pieces of the story. One woman, named in the press as Camilla, claimed to have had a years-long affair with the king, something both tantalizing and mortifying for an institution built on dignity by distance. Still, the monarchy survived. Why? Because in constitutional monarchies, scandal doesn't always equal destruction. Carl Gustaf remained on the throne. His daughter, Crown Princess Victoria, remained poised to inherit. The palace circled the wagons, and the press, after its initial frenzy, moved on to newer, shinier distractions. But the legacy of the scandal lingered. It damaged the king's popularity and prompted renewed discussions about abolishing the monarchy altogether. For a royal house that had always tried to avoid the overt drama of its European cousins, it was a sharp reminder that secrets, especially salacious ones, rarely stay buried. And if you thought Sweden had cornered the market on royal marital controversy, the next scandal will take you back to Denmark, where a king's love for a ballerina not only scandalized the court, but redefined what kind of woman could be called a queen. Denmark's Frederick VII and Countess Danner. In the pantheon of royal misalliances, few caused as much pearl clutching in 19th century Europe as the marriage between King Frederick VII of Denmark and Louise Rasmussen, a woman of the theatre, a former ballerina, and, worst of all in the eyes of the court, a commoner. Born to a working-class family in Copenhagen, Rasmussen trained in ballet but quickly transitioned into life as a fashion entrepreneur, though her path into royal circles came through her status as a courtesan. By the time she met Frederick, she was already known in the city's elite nightlife. Their relationship bloomed in public, to the horror of Denmark's stiff-collared aristocracy. Frederick VII, already twice divorced and carrying the erratic temperament of a man who knew he'd be the last of his line, fell hard. In 1850, he elevated Rasmussen to the nobility, granting her the title Countess Danner. The backlash was immediate. She was labelled vulgar, manipulative, and unworthy of the crown-adjacent space she now occupied. But Frederick didn't care. He insisted on treating her as his consort informally at first, then officially. She accompanied him to public events, resided at royal palaces, and effectively played the role of queen without the title. The Danish court fumed. Rumours circulated about her influence on policy, her background, her accent, even her furniture. The nobility boycotted events. Foreign dignitaries raised eyebrows. Satirists sharpened their pens. And yet, Frederick remained loyal. Their relationship endured until his death in 1863, after which Countess Danner was forced into a more private life. She was excluded from many royal honours and faced open hostility from the royal family. Still, she turned her energies toward philanthropy, founding a women's shelter that still bears her name today. In hindsight, the scandal wasn't so much about who Louise Rasmussen was. It was about what she represented, a break in royal protocol, a challenge to class hierarchy, and the terrifying idea that a king might marry for affection rather than alliance. And if that's enough to make European nobles squirm, imagine what happens when a king's mistress becomes his wife and their relationship ends up costing him his throne altogether. For that, we head southeast into a kingdom that would trade love for exile, power for passion, Romania's Carol II and Magda Lupescu. The story of King Carol II of Romania and Magda Lupescu reads like a romance novel written in a minor key. Passion, scandal, exile, return, abdication, and a final chapter played out far from the throne that once seemed his birthright. Carol was never destined for a peaceful reign. He was the eldest son of King Ferdinand and heir to the Romanian throne, but from an early age he developed a reputation for impetuousness and disobedience. His family, wary of his romantic entanglements and political unreliability, tried to limit his power at every turn. Enter Magda Lupescu. Born Elena Lupescu, she was the daughter of a Romanian Jewish pharmacist and a Catholic mother. Neither background helped her in a country wrestling with its own anti-Semitic undercurrents. She was divorced, flamboyant, and deeply charismatic. Carol met her in the 1922nd, and they were inseparable almost immediately. The relationship enraged the political class, alienated the royal family, and became a fixation of the international press. Carol had already caused scandal by abandoning his first wife and son, the future King Michael I, and fleeing Romania with Magda. He returned in 1930 to claim the throne, promising to reform and distance himself from Lupescu. That promise lasted all of 5 minutes. Once securely on the throne, he reinstated her position in his life, though never officially at court, and treated her as his consort in all but name. Romania, struggling with economic woes and rising fascist movements, was not in the mood for scandal. Magda became a symbol unfairly, but inevitably of everything the opposition claimed was wrong with the monarchy. Corruption, moral decay, favoritism. Carol, meanwhile, clung to power through a mixture of political scheming and personal stubbornness. By 1940, the pressure was overwhelming. Under threat from the Iron Guard, Germany, and internal chaos, Carol abdicated in favor of his teenage son and fled the country with Magda at his side. They wandered Europe in exile, always slightly out of place, always looking back. Eventually, they married in Rio de Janeiro in 1947. It was a quiet ceremony for a couple whose love had once shaken a kingdom. Carol II died in 1953. Magda lived until 1977. They were buried together in Portugal, far from the palace, far from the headlines, far from the throne that couldn't survive their love. Because sometimes, the scandal isn't in the affair. It's in the refusal to give it up. And as we'll see next, some kings didn't just keep their lovers, they built private movie theaters to film fantasies no one was ever supposed to see. Spain's Alfonso XIII and the royal pornography rumors. King Alfonso XIII of Spain was born into a crown and baptized into instability. His father died before he was born. His mother ruled as regent, and Spain, torn between monarchy and modernity, treated the young king like a placeholder rather than a leader. By the time Alfonso reached adulthood, he had inherited a fragile constitutional monarchy and a court bloated with pomp, privilege, and a growing appetite for distraction. Alfonso, for his part, embraced distraction with flair. Publicly, he championed modernization, railways, infrastructure, even early flirtations with democracy. Privately, his reputation skewed toward the more indulgent. Affairs were common. Mistresses were acknowledged, even if never officially. But what truly distinguished Alfonso XIII from other scandal-prone monarchs was the persistent and persistently unconfirmed rumor that he commissioned pornographic films for his personal viewing. Yes, films. Silent-era, celluloid fantasies rumored to be created specifically for royal eyes. The origin of the claim is murky. Some allege that in the 1910 and 20, Alfonso financed a series of erotic shorts produced in France and Spain, often using scripts penned under the pseudonym Fernand. Others claim he had a private theatre installed in Madrid to screen such material, a royal cinephile with scandalous taste. Historian Javier Barrero and film archivists have unearthed enough circumstantial evidence to keep the rumour alive, though hard proof remains elusive. A handful of early 20th century adult films with royal-linked provenance such as El Confessor have been studied for stylistic clues and financing records that might trace back to the palace. But here's the twist. For all the pearl-clutching these stories provoked, they say more about the institution of monarchy than they do about Alfonso himself. The notion that a king, tired of pageantry and responsibility, might escape into privately funded fantasies struck a nerve in a country drifting toward republicanism. The image of a king watching silent smut while his nation suffered economic crises and colonial collapse wasn't just salacious, it was symbolic. Alfonso's personal life was filled with contradictions. He married Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, a British royal with impeccable credentials. The marriage, however, was rocky. Alfonso had multiple mistresses and children outside the marriage. The Queen retreated into illness and religious devotion. The King retreated into silence and spectacle. In 1931, amid growing unrest and the rise of the Second Spanish Republic, Alfonso went into exile. He never formally abdicated, just disappeared. He lived out his final years in Rome, reflecting on a reign best remembered for its missed opportunities, shadowy escapades, and whispered reels of film no one could confirm or forget. And if Alfonso escaped through celluloid shadows, the next monarch escaped through excess. A sultan whose appetites were so extravagant they became legend, whose palace harem redefined the word indulgence, and whose reign would be remembered less for governance and more for spectacle. Ottoman Sultan Ibrahim the Mad and the harem scandals. In the kaleidoscopic history of the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Ibrahim I occupies a particularly chaotic corner. Known to history as Ibrahim the Mad, his reign, 1640–1648, was short, disordered, and dominated by whispers of instability, of conspiracy, and of a harem so opulent and excessive that it practically swallowed the empire whole. Ibrahim was the son of Sultan Ahmed I and spent much of his early life imprisoned in the infamous cafes, the gilded cage where Ottoman princes were sequestered to prevent succession conflicts. Isolation, paranoia, and psychological strain were par for the course. By the time he emerged as Sultan in 1640, following the death of his brother Murad IV, he was already a fractured man. What followed was less a reign and more a royal fever dream. Ibrahim was reportedly obsessed with his harem. Unlike his predecessors, who used the harem as a political and dynastic tool, Ibrahim treated it as his personal universe. He expanded it to include hundreds of concubines, demanded rare and elaborate rituals, and allegedly spent vast sums of state money constructing floating palaces and extravagant costumes just for the harem's use. His court became a breeding ground for absurdity. He was rumored to have ordered palace officials to search the empire for the fattest woman alive, believing such a figure would bring him good fortune. The woman, once found, was installed in the harem with great fanfare, and given the nickname Sheker Pear, piece of sugar. Whether she brought good luck is unclear. What is clear is that state finances were spiraling into the abyss. The empire, meanwhile, didn't find the situation amusing. Officials and religious leaders, already weary of the palace's indulgences, watched in horror as the treasury dwindled and internal revolts simmered. Ibrahim's mother, Kusem Sultan, attempted to intervene, but even her legendary influence couldn't redirect his obsessions. Eventually, the patience of the court ran out. In 1648, Ibrahim was deposed in a coup orchestrated by high-ranking officials and religious elites. He was imprisoned, ironically, back in a cage not unlike the one of his youth, and executed shortly thereafter. He was 33 years old. His legacy? A cautionary tale, wrapped in velvet and perfumed intrigue. His reign revealed what could happen when absolute power met personal delusion, when a royal court became untethered from reality, and when a harem ceased to be a symbol of dynastic stability and instead became a mirror of royal madness. But Ibrahim was hardly the only Ottoman sultan to scandalize the palace corridors. The next ruler in our parade of royal indiscretions broke centuries of protocol, not through madness, but through marriage, choosing love, controversy, and a concubine turned consort who would change the empire forever. Suleiman the Magnificent and Hurrem Sultan. Roxalan. Suleiman. I remembered in the west as Suleiman the Magnificent and in the east as Kanuni the Lawgiver, was perhaps the most successful sultan in Ottoman history. He presided over a golden age of territorial expansion, legal reform, architectural brilliance, and courtly sophistication. But amid all the imperial achievements, one relationship threatened to upend centuries of tradition. His bond with a concubine named Roxalana, better known to history as Hurrem Sultan. To understand the scandal, you have to understand the rules. Ottoman sultans didn't marry. They kept concubines politically convenient, spiritually flexible, and strategically interchangeable. The idea was to avoid favoritism and prevent the consolidation of too much influence in any one woman. Hurrem shattered that rule entirely. She was born Alexandra Lisowska, likely in modern-day Ukraine, and brought to the Ottoman court through the empire's vast slave networks. Bright, charismatic, and fiercely ambitious, she quickly rose through the ranks of the harem. Her intelligence was matched by a shrewd understanding of palace politics, and soon she captured the attention of the Sultan himself. Suleiman didn't just favor her, he freed her. Then, unthinkably, he married her. It was the first legal marriage of a reigning Ottoman sultan in over 200 years. The court gasped. Religious leaders bogged. Harem officials fumed. But Suleiman didn't care. Hurrem became his official consort and wielded unprecedented influence. She was deeply involved in court politics, foreign diplomacy, and charitable works. She corresponded with leaders abroad, commissioned mosques and schools, and helped shape succession by advocating for her sons. Naturally, this made enemies. She was accused of manipulating Suleiman, orchestrating palace intrigues, and even having rivals exiled or executed. The most famous casualty was Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son from another concubine, who was strangled under dubious charges of treason, an act many believed Hurrem had engineered to ensure her own son's rise. And yet, her influence endured. After her death, Suleiman commissioned a lavish mausoleum for her near his own. She was the first imperial consort to be buried in the same complex as a reigning sultan, an honor that made her role in Ottoman history both permanent and official. The scandal of Hurrem was not in her existence, it was in her elevation. She disrupted a carefully maintained structure of royal detachment, and in doing so, revealed just how precarious that structure truly was. And if you think royal influence ended at one ambitious woman, wait until you meet the Sultan whose bedroom was more populous than most villages, and whose alleged 1,000 children would give even the most dramatic dynasties a run for their silverware. Morocco's Moulay Ismail and the 1,000-child legend. Sultans, like emperors and kings across the world, have long measured their greatness not just in territory or legacy, but in heirs, though few ever took that goal quite as literally as Moulay Ismail of Morocco. Reigning from 1672 to 1727, Moulay Ismail ibn Sharif was known to history as the Warrior King, a fearsome consolidator of the Alawite dynasty and a relentless unifier of Morocco. He was also, according to both local tradition and later European chroniclers, the father of over 1,000 children, 1,042 to be precise, if you believe the 18th century diplomat who said it with a straight face. Historians have debated the number endlessly. Some argue the figure was inflated by French envoys hoping to caricature the Moroccan court as barbaric. Others suggest the number, while exaggerated, isn't wholly implausible. Moulay Ismail's harem reportedly housed hundreds of concubines, and he reigned for over 50 years. A team of researchers in 2012 even published a study in PLOS ONE attempting to determine the biological feasibility of such prolific fatherhood. Their conclusion? It's technically possible if the man was, let's say, very committed to the task. But numbers aside, the real scandal lay in what the legend symbolized. Moulay Ismail's court operated on divine authority and sheer intimidation. He demanded loyalty, absolute control, and obedience over land, people, and reproduction. His harem wasn't just a symbol of virility, it was a calculated extension of political domination. Every child he fathered extended the dynasty's reach, complicated succession, and reinforced his image as a ruler blessed by both God and genes. There were consequences. Internal strife among his sons erupted frequently. Succession disputes lingered for decades after his death. And while his reign brought relative stability and centralized control, it also created a royal lineage so vast that later genealogists needed ledgers the size of small libraries just to keep track. The tale of the 1,000 children became a staple of Orientalist imagination, a way for European travelers to gawk at a non-European ruler who defied both moral expectations and mathematical reason. But behind the exoticism lay the usual story. A ruler using intimacy, power, and paternity to build a personal empire inside an already sprawling one. And as we shift from North Africa to the land of the pharaohs, another monarch emerges, this one clad in Italian suits, adored by the press, and scandalized by his own excesses. The playboy king who was less concerned with governance and more with the glamorous chaos of the good life. Egypt's King Farouk and his playboy reputation. King Farouk of Egypt, crowned in 1936 at just 16 years old, was an emperor in training with a country at the edge of change and a personal appetite that knew few limits. His reign was defined by lavishness, extravagance, and a spectacular inability to distinguish between statecraft and shopping sprees. At first, the Egyptian public adored him. He was young, handsome, and impeccably European in style. He drove luxury cars, spoke multiple languages, and represented a modernizing monarchy in a country trying to wrestle its way out of colonial entanglements. But beneath the polished image was a man consumed by indulgence. Farouk had a reputation for excess in everything: food, gambling, possessions, and yes, romance. Cairo's elite circles and European resorts buzzed with tales of the king's amorous pursuits, whispered encounters, and late-night escapades. The international press turned his private life into a public drama. He reportedly once declared that, "If a man can't have 1,000 women, he doesn't deserve one." A line that played well in gossip columns, but less so in the halls of Parliament. His behaviour escalated from eccentric to outright embarrassing. He was accused of hoarding hundreds of cars, collecting rare coins, including some that mysteriously vanished from museums, and once, allegedly, stealing a pocket watch from Winston Churchill during a state dinner. Whether true or not, the symbolism stuck. Farouk was a monarch who couldn't or wouldn't control his impulses. His personal life was equally chaotic. He married Queen Farida in a grand spectacle, only to divorce her a decade later after producing 3 daughters but no male heir. His second marriage to a teenage commoner further alienated the traditionalist establishment, while his court devolved into a palace of whispers, rivalries, and scandal fatigue. By the early 1952, Egypt's patience had worn thin. The economy faltered, public resentment grew, and Farouk's image became that of a monarch trapped in a fantasy, while his nation struggled to find its footing. In 1952, a military coup led by the Free Officers Movement and a young Gamal Abdel Nasser forced Farouk to abdicate and flee into exile. He left aboard his royal yacht, bound for Italy with several suitcases full of jewellery and regrets. He died overweight and obscure in Rome in 1965, far from the throne he'd inherited and the empire he'd squandered. His was a reign defined not by policy or diplomacy, but by spectacle, a walking cautionary tale of how personal excess can become national embarrassment. And while Farouk feasted and fell, another monarch still very much in power today has drawn international fire for how he selects his wives, blending tradition, ceremony, and controversy into one of the modern world's most eyebrow-raising royal customs. Eswatini's King Mswati III and the reed dance controversy. In the small, landlocked kingdom of Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, tradition is the bedrock of royal identity. And no tradition looms larger or sparks more global scrutiny than the umhlanga, or reed dance. A ceremony meant to honour chastity, celebrate womanhood, and offer homage to the Queen Mother. It also functions as the setting for something far more controversial: the public selection of the king's next wife. King Mswati III, Africa's last absolute monarch, ascended the throne in 1986 at just 18 years old. Since then, he has amassed a fortune in wives literally. As of the latest counts, Mswati has married at least 15 women, many of whom were introduced during the annual Reed Dance. Each year, tens of thousands of young, unmarried women, some barely out of adolescence, gather in traditional attire to dance before the royal family. Officially, it's a cultural event, a celebration of heritage. Unofficially, it's widely viewed as a royal marriage market, with the king reportedly using the ceremony to choose new consorts. The optics have drawn international condemnation. Human rights organizations and foreign media outlets have accused the king of using tradition as a cover for exploitation. Critics argue that the practice perpetuates outdated gender roles, objectifies women, and conflates cultural pride with monarchical privilege. Mswati, for his part, has dismissed the outrage as cultural imperialism. He insists the Reed Dance is voluntary and that the monarchy is a source of unity, not abuse. And within Eswatini, many citizens do see the monarchy as a symbol of national identity, resisting foreign interference in domestic customs. But the controversies don't stop at the dance. Mswati lives in staggering opulence private jets, luxury cars, lavish palaces, while the vast majority of his subjects live in poverty. His marriages, often accompanied by extravagant gifts and state-funded perks, have become symbols of elite excess in a country where economic inequality remains a pressing concern. In 2002, the scandal deepened when a 17-year-old girl selected as the king's future wife fled the palace, seeking asylum and alleging she had been taken against her will. The incident sparked a diplomatic mess, intensified global criticism, and shone a harsh light on the blurred line between royal tradition and individual agency. Still, the Reed Dance continues. So does the monarchy. And so does the uneasy question that hovers over it all. Where does culture end and power begin? As the ceremonial drums fade, we now travel further east, to a kingdom where scandal didn't hide behind ceremony, but strutted through it, complete with golden palaces, forced court entertainers, and a king so feared by his people, even his pleasures became public dread. Yon Sanangun of Joseon and the Pleasure Palace. In the storied dynastic records of Korea's Joseon era, where Confucian virtue reigned supreme and monarchs were meant to model moral rectitude, Yon Sanangun is remembered not as a ruler, but as a cautionary tale, a tyrant with a royal title, a despot in silk robes, and above all, a man whose private indulgences bled dangerously into public cruelty. Yon Sanangun, born Yi Young, was the son of King Songjong and Queen Yun, the latter of whom was executed when he was just a boy. Officially, the reason was court politics and improper conduct. Unofficially, the trauma of witnessing his mother's erasure would fester for decades, erupting later in a reign fueled by paranoia, repression, and staggering excess. When he ascended the throne in 1494, Yon Sanangun inherited not just power but a tradition of strict royal propriety. The Joseon dynasty was rooted in Confucian values, restraint, hierarchy, and a carefully maintained separation between private pleasure and public duty. Yon Sanangun saw these not as guiding principles, but as obstacles to be obliterated. One of his most infamous decisions was the construction of a personal amusement hall inside the palace, known in later accounts as a pleasure palace. He ordered the abduction of female entertainers, widows, and even daughters of noble families to fill its halls. Musicians, dancers, poets, and artisans were conscripted en masse, pulled from their lives, and pressed into the king's orbit for his personal amusement. It wasn't simply indulgence. It was spectacle. The court, once a stage for rituals and statecraft, became a theatre of the king's desires. Days were spent in feasts and performances, while the bureaucracy languished. Officials who objected were exiled, imprisoned, or worse. Confucian scholars, the moral backbone of the kingdom, were especially targeted. 2 infamous purges wiped out dozens of them, a retaliatory cleansing of anyone who dared critique the throne. Yon Sanangun's obsession with pleasure became a state policy. Taxes increased, citizens starved, public executions became more common, and dissent was practically outlawed. His paranoia grew, as did his delusions of grandeur. He replaced rational advisors with flatterers, remade court customs in his image, and renamed palaces and institutions to reflect his personal glory. Eventually, the court could take no more. In 1506, a coup led by high-ranking officials and palace guards dethroned him. Yon Sanangun was exiled to a remote island, stripped of royal titles, and died in obscurity. His brief, brutal reign was so reviled that even today his name is often omitted from official temple rituals honoring former kings. His legacy is one of unchecked power, the dangers of unresolved trauma, and the terrible ease with which a crown can become a mask for tyranny. And while Korea has had its share of unconventional monarchs, none blurred the lines between personal obsession and political disaster quite like Yon Sanangun. But he wasn't the only Korean monarch to raise eyebrows behind palace walls. A century earlier, another royal had turned the court upside down not with violence, but with his shocking choice of companions, King Gongmin of Goryeo and his male favourites. Before the Joseon dynasty brought Confucian orthodoxy to Korea, there was Goryeo, a dynasty that balanced Buddhism, aristocratic power, and Mongol interference in a precarious political tightrope. And toward the end of its reign came King Gongmin, a ruler whose personal life ignited scandal after scandal, all while the kingdom teetered on collapse. King Gongmin took the throne in 1351 during a time of deep uncertainty. The Goryeo dynasty was under heavy Mongol influence. Its royal family intermarried with the Yuan imperial court, and national sovereignty was a polite illusion. Gongmin, whose wife was a Mongol princess, began his reign in the shadow of foreign control. But following the decline of the Yuan dynasty, he seized the moment to reassert Goryeo's independence. Politically, he was effective. He worked to reclaim lost territory, restructured the military, and reduced the power of corrupt aristocratic clans. But behind palace doors, his personal life soon outshone his reforms. After the death of his wife, Queen Noguk, in 1365, Gongmin fell into a deep depression and into the company of male attendants, many of whom were elevated to positions of extraordinary influence. These favourites, often described in court documents as beautiful young men, were not just companions but political actors. Gongmin gave them land, titles, and access to power. Some were rumoured to wield more authority than official ministers. Confucian scholars, already skeptical of Gongmin's artistic and emotional temperament, reacted with moral outrage. The presence of so many favoured men in the inner court, combined with the king's increasing neglect of traditional governance, set off waves of criticism. Satirical poems, letters, and records from the era document both the dismay of court officials and the quiet fear that Gongmin's private choices were affecting public policy. To make matters worse, Gongmin reportedly tasked some of these favourites with selecting concubines from among the noble families, a bizarre reversal of palace norms that further inflamed tensions. The resulting instability made the palace a hive of intrigue and resentment. In 1374, Gongmin was assassinated by a member of his own inner circle. Some say it was politically motivated. Others suggest a lover's betrayal. Either way, his death marked the end of an experiment in royal favoritism that the conservative order would not soon forget. Though some historians today view Gongmin with more nuance as a king who struggled with grief, autonomy, And the burdens of power, the scandal surrounding his favourites, remains one of Korea's most talked about royal taboos. But if King Gongmin's court was accused of indulgence, the next ruler in our parade of royal misbehaviour took things to supernatural extremes, where intimacy, alchemy, and a desperate search for immortality collided in one of China's most infamous imperial scandals. China's Jiajing Emperor and the Alchemical Revolt. In the grand lineage of Ming emperors, Zhu Hukong, the Jiajing Emperor, stands apart, not for his conquests or reforms, but for his obsession with Taoist immortality and the lengths to which he went to pursue it. His reign, 1521-1567, became a strange blend of isolation, mysticism, and courtly dysfunction, culminating in one of the strangest attempted coups in Chinese history. The 1542 Palace Women's Revolt. The scandal began, as many do, with ideology. The Jiajing Emperor was deeply devoted to Taoism, particularly the strand that promised eternal life through elaborate alchemical rituals. These rituals, as recorded in court documents and private diaries, often required bizarre ingredients, including, controversially, the involvement of very young palace girls believed to hold vital energies necessary for the emperor's longevity. The emperor withdrew from day-to-day governance, spending more time with alchemists than ministers. He commissioned hundreds of volumes on esoteric rites, refused audiences, and allowed court eunuchs and concubines to manage the bureaucracy. The Forbidden City became more than a palace, it became a sanctum for experimental theology. Within this strange world, dozens of young girls were conscripted into palace service not just as concubines, but as vessels in the emperor's alchemical pursuits. Though never officially recorded in explicit terms, the practice drew quiet outrage from court insiders, including the empress herself, who reportedly viewed the emperor's behavior as both morally corrupt and spiritually dangerous. In 1542, a group of palace women, many of them teenagers, who had been selected for the alchemical rites, conspired to assassinate the emperor in his sleep. Their plan was astonishing in its boldness. Using curtain ties and silk cords, they attempted to strangle the emperor one night during a ritual bath. But one participant panicked, confessed, and the plan unraveled before it could be completed. The punishment was immediate and severe. Dozens of women were executed. Others were tortured. The empress, suspected of sympathizing with the rebels, was deposed and died shortly after under mysterious circumstances. The scandal shocked the empire not because the emperor had nearly been killed, but because it revealed just how far removed he had become from the moral and bureaucratic center of the state. The Forbidden City, once a symbol of imperial order, now seemed like a dark sanctum of mystical delusion and exploitation. Jiajing continued his reign for another 25 years, still obsessed with immortality, still steeped in ritual. He died in 1567, having failed to achieve the eternal life he'd so desperately pursued. But his scandal left a permanent scar on the Ming court and a grim warning: when a ruler chases immortality at the cost of humanity, it's not just his soul that suffers, it's the entire empire. And as we move forward, another Chinese emperor will show that when it comes to decadence, destruction, and the lure of the forbidden, the Ming dynasty still had a few stories left to tell. China's Zhengde Emperor and the Pleasure Palaces. If the Jiajing Emperor turned the Forbidden City into an alchemical laboratory, his predecessor, the Zhengde Emperor, Su Huzhao, turned it into a personal playground. His reign, from 1505 to 1521, is remembered less for statecraft than for elaborate disguises, bizarre stunts, and a level of courtly indulgence that left even hardened bureaucrats baffled. He ascended the throne at 14, bright-eyed and impressionable, with the Ming dynasty still relatively stable. But instead of building on that foundation, the Zhengde emperor retreated into a world of fantasy. Almost immediately, he became obsessed with adventure, military theatrics, and exotic pageantry. He took to giving himself fake titles, General Zhu of Leopard Cavalry, being a favorite, and would stage fake military campaigns, galloping out of the palace in costume, while palace officials scrambled to maintain decorum behind him. At the heart of his escapism was a network of Baofan leopard houses or pleasure palaces constructed within and around the Forbidden City. These were not simply brothels or lounges. They were immersive fantasy chambers where the emperor could indulge in roleplay, host entertainers, and vanish from the burdens of the crown. Courtiers and concubines were enlisted into these elaborate performances. He even constructed an exotic zoo, filled with animals brought from overseas, including lions and leopards, giving the entire court the air of a surreal, royal masquerade. But what elevated the Zhengde emperor's behavior from quirky to scandalous was his utter neglect of state affairs. Memorials from officials went unread, ministers were dismissed for offering sound advice. The Confucian establishment was horrified, not just by the debauchery, but by the emperor's open contempt for his role as a moral exemplar. One of his most infamous actions came when he brought Muslim merchants and women from Central Asia into the palace and allowed them unprecedented access to courtly power. Rumors swirled of drinking contests, secret feasts, and harem expansions that blurred cultural and political lines. To the staunchly conservative bureaucrats, this wasn't just indulgent, it was un-Chinese. Still, his reign might have been remembered as harmless eccentricity until he died. In 1521, at age 29, the Zhengde emperor fell ill after nearly drowning during yet another whimsical journey outside the palace. His death sparked a succession crisis and left a vacuum at the heart of the empire. His childless rule and alienation of the scholarly class had weakened the dynasty's foundations. What's left of Zhengde is a footnote soaked in irony, a man with absolute power who played pretend until reality caught up with him. And as we leave China's palaces behind, we turn toward the oil-rich kingdom of Brunei, where royal scandals don't hide behind red silk. They travel first class, leave receipts, and come with international headlines. Prince Jeffrey Bolkiah of Brunei and the billion-dollar scandal. If ever there was a royal scandal so extravagantly absurd it seemed like the plot of a satirical novel, it would be the case of Prince Jeffrey Bolkiah of Brunei. As the younger brother of Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah, the absolute ruler of one of the world's richest oil-producing nations, Jeffrey was entrusted with overseeing Brunei's state investment agency. What followed was a masterclass in how to turn state funds into personal fantasy. During the 1992nd, Prince Jeffrey served as chairman of the Brunei Investment Agency, BIA, which managed billions in state wealth. What he did with those billions became the stuff of international legend. Private jets, yachts, luxury hotels in New York and Paris, a stable of Rolls-Royces, a mansion so large and absurdly ornate that it made Versailles look minimalist. But the real headlines came from the more personal side of his portfolio. Allegations of extravagant parties, controversial liaisons, and financial excesses so blatant they triggered international lawsuits. The most infamous claim, that he used state funds to bankroll a lifestyle involving not just lavish real estate, but eye-popping personal expenses totaling over $14 billion. His actions came under scrutiny when the Asian financial crisis hit and Brunei's books were reviewed more closely. In 2000, the Bruneian government sued Prince Jeffrey in a British court, alleging embezzlement and misappropriation of public funds. Geoffrey denied the charges but ultimately reached a settlement, agreeing to return many of his assets, though he later tried to reclaim some, arguing the terms had been misunderstood. The resulting legal battles dragged on for years, with court documents revealing a world of opulence that stunned even the jaded. A London High Court judgment described Geoffrey's spending as prodigious and his management style as virtually non-existent. At one point, he was alleged to have purchased over 2,000 luxury cars and filled entire warehouses with unused goods bought on a whim. His lifestyle became emblematic of oil wealth royalty detached from reality, accountability, or restraint. What makes the scandal particularly poignant is its duality. Brunei, under Sultan Hassanal, is an officially conservative Muslim country governed by Sharia law with strict moral codes and public piety. Meanwhile, the Sultan's brother had turned Brunei's wealth into a circus of gold-plated eccentricity. The contradiction was staggering, even by royal standards. Eventually, the scandals faded from front-page news, but Geoffrey remains a symbol of how dynastic privilege, when unchecked, can spiral into absurdity. And yet, for all his extravagance, he was never officially disowned. Because in the end, family is family. Even when they tried to buy the Plaza Hotel with national oil profits. But not all scandals live in old money. Some arrive wearing sashes, pageant crowns, and tabloid headlines. Our next royal didn't just walk away from the throne, he strutted off it, paparazzi in tow, leaving behind a media firestorm and a confused constitutional monarchy, Malaysia's Sultan Muhammad V and the Miss Moscow marriage. In the annals of royal scandal, few stories unfold with the cinematic clarity and Instagram filters of Sultan Muhammad V of Malaysia and his short-lived marriage to Oksana Vojvodina, a Russian beauty queen crowned Miss Moscow in 2015. It was a union that stunned the Malaysian public, mystified constitutional experts, and ultimately left more questions than answers. Sultan Muhammad V, born Tengku Muhammad Faris Petra, became Malaysia's 15th Yang di-Pertuan, Agong, in 2016, a position elected among the 9 hereditary rulers of Malaysia's states. He was relatively young, known for his modest demeanour and interest in falconry and Islamic scholarship. His reign began quietly. It would not end that way. In 2018, he took a mysterious 2-month medical leave from his royal duties. While the palace issued vague statements, the real reason surfaced quickly. He had travelled to Russia, where he reportedly married Oksana Vojvodina in a private ceremony. Photos soon leaked her in a white gown, him in traditional Malay dress. The palace, caught off guard, neither confirmed nor denied. But social media filled in the gaps. The issue wasn't just the marriage, it was the secrecy, the optics, and the contradictions. Oksana's past as a beauty queen and rumoured modelling career clashed with the conservative image expected of a Malaysian queen. Rumours of premarital photo shoots and a reality television appearance spread rapidly. Critics questioned the suitability of the match. Traditionalists were scandalised. The religious establishment winced. Then, in January 2019, the unthinkable happened. Sultan Muhammad V abdicated. He became the first Malaysian monarch to step down mid-reign. No reason was given. The timing made it clear the marriage had played a significant role. By mid-2019, news broke that the couple had divorced just weeks after the birth of their son. Conflicting statements emerged. Oksana insisted the child was the rightful heir. The palace issued a quiet denial. Legal documents were disputed, photos were posted, then deleted. It was the monarchy as reality television, and the audience was global. In Malaysia, the scandal struck at the heart of a delicate political structure. The monarchy, though largely ceremonial, is revered. A public, messy saga involving a foreign spouse, a secret wedding, and an abdication through the institution into unfamiliar territory. And yet, no official explanation was ever given. The palace moved on. A new king was elected. Sultan Muhammad V returned to Kelantan, largely silent, his royal portrait still hanging in buildings across the country. The entire episode lasted less than 2 years. But it lingers as one of the most unusual, tabloid-ready royal sagas in modern memory. And next, we cross oceans and empires to find another monarch who ruled with charisma, conquered hearts with rebellion, and turned the imperial palace of Brazil into a dramatic theatre of love, scandal, and messy imperial passion. Brazil's Emperor Pedro I and Domitila de Castro. In the early 19th century, as Latin America convulsed with revolution and empire breaking, one monarch stood out not for his battlefield victories or diplomatic finesse, but for his melodramatic love life. Emperor Pedro I of Brazil, the charismatic founder of the Brazilian Empire, led a political separation from Portugal and then promptly entangled himself in a scandal so personal it nearly undid the imperial image he worked so hard to build. At the center of the storm was Domitila de Castro Canto e Melo, better known by the title Pedro gave her, the Marchioness of Santos. Born to an aristocratic but modest São Paulo family, Domitila caught the emperor's eye in 1822, around the time Brazil was asserting its independence. What followed was a torrid and very public affair. Pedro was married at the time to Archduchess Maria Leopoldina of Austria, a Habsburg princess whose intelligence and political savvy earned her respect across the empire. Domitila, by contrast, was perceived as bold, sensuous, and politically naive, a contrast that only fueled the court's disdain. But Pedro was unmoved by appearances. He installed Domitila at court, gave her lavish titles and estates, and forced her presence into the rigid structure of imperial society. The problem wasn't just the affair, it was how unapologetically Pedro conducted it. Letters between the emperor and Domitila, many of which survive, revealed a deeply infatuated ruler who referred to himself in cringe-inducing terms like the demon and your little tiger. The correspondence reads less like statecraft and more like serialized romance fiction, complete with declarations of undying love and anatomical nicknames. Unsurprisingly, this did not sit well with the Brazilian public. Maria Leopoldina, already suffering from poor health, was humiliated. The palace staff whispered. Conservative factions were appalled. The imperial project, which required stability, dignity, and public trust, was being undermined by a royal soap opera. In 1826, Empress Leopoldina died likely of illness, though some whispered of heartbreak. The nation mourned. Pedro's approval ratings plummeted. Under pressure, he gradually distanced himself from Domitila, though not before granting her daughter a noble title and trying to maintain their relationship under the radar. Eventually, he married Princess Amélie of Leuchtenberg, a more politically acceptable match. Domitila was dismissed from court, retired to São Paulo, and lived the rest of her life as a respected landowner and controversial legend. Pedro I would abdicate in 1831 and return to Portugal, where he died a few years later. His time in Brazil is remembered for its bold declarations and messy personal contradictions. Domitila, meanwhile, became a symbol of the tension between passion and propriety. In a monarchy, trying to prove it could function like Europe, while still carving out its own identity. And speaking of monarchs caught between love, power, and social outrage, the next royal never even tried to pretend. His male favourite wasn't a rumour, it was a walking, talking scandal who wore pearls at court and wielded more political influence than most lords dared dream of. James I of England. And George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. James I of England and VI of Scotland was many things. The first monarch of a unified Britain, an intellectual fond of theological debate, and the namesake of one of the most famous Bible translations in history. But perhaps his most talked about legacy, at least within the court corridors and ambassadorial whispers of his time, was his relationship with George Villiers, later elevated to Duke of Buckingham. Villiers was young, beautiful, and calculating. James was aging, lonely, and increasingly isolated from his more formal advisors. Their relationship began around 1614, when Villiers was introduced to the king as a handsome courtier and rapidly rose through the ranks. Within a few years, he was showered with titles, lands, and monopolies. By 1623, he had become Lord High Admiral of England and one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. To his critics, Buckingham was a parasite. To James, he was something else entirely. The king's letters to Villiers were effusive, affectionate, and by 17th century standards startlingly intimate. He wrote of kissing Villiers, called him "my sweet child and wife," and signed letters with phrases like "your old dad and husband." While the precise nature of their relationship remains debated among historians, the emotional depth is undeniable. Court gossip thrived. Foreign ambassadors sent coded messages back to their home courts about the great love between the king and his favourite. Parliamentarians, particularly the Puritan faction, seethed. Not only did they find the relationship morally suspect, they were alarmed by the level of influence Villiers held over royal decisions, particularly in matters of war, patronage, and foreign alliances. The scandal reached its zenith when Villiers accompanied Prince Charles on a secret mission to Spain in 1623 to woo the Spanish Infanta, a trip that ended in diplomatic embarrassment and made both men look foolish. Still, Villiers' power remained intact. After James's death in 1625, he continued to wield influence under Charles I until his assassination in 1628 by a disgruntled officer. James's open affection for Villiers defied the decorum expected of a monarch, especially one ruling over a deeply conservative and increasingly anxious Protestant nation. While he never confirmed anything publicly, the king's personal attachments became political liabilities, feeding into broader concerns about favoritism, court corruption, and the erosion of traditional moral standards. And while England might have been scandalized by a king's romantic letters, the next monarch we'll meet turned scandal into policy. He didn't hide his lovers, he employed them, promoted them, and let them remake his court in their image. For Charles II, fidelity wasn't a virtue, it was a constraint, and he refused to be constrained. Charles II and his merry court of mistresses. If James I blurred the line between royal friendship and infatuation, Charles II obliterated it altogether. Known to history as the Merry Monarch, Charles II returned to the English throne in 1660 after a decade of Republican rule and immediately turned court life into a debauched renaissance of flirtation, theatre, and open relationships. After years in exile during the English Civil War, Charles had developed a taste for French fashion, Parisian libertinism, and most significantly, a kind of political realism that saw personal pleasure and public favour as two sides of the same coin. His court was not a place of moral restraint but a revolving door of mistresses, entertainers, and scandalous poetry. Chief among his many mistresses were Barbara Villiers, Nell Gwynn, Louise de Querouaille, and Moll Davis, each occupying her own chapter in the royal drama. Barbara Villiers, for example, was already married when she began her relationship with Charles. She became the Countess of Castlemaine and was granted an apartment in Whitehall, where she bore the king 5 children and openly influenced appointments and pensions. Then came Nell Gwynn, an actress known as much for her wit as her beauty. She met Charles after a play, flirted her way into his affections, and became a crowd favourite. Unlike other mistresses who sought noble titles or political power, Nell retained her commoner charm. She famously told a mob mistaking her for a rival, "I am the Protestant whore." The people loved her for it. Louise de Querouaille, on the other hand, was French, Catholic, and seen by many as a political agent. Her influence and Charles's favour was treated with suspicion, especially by Parliament. She was given the title Duchess of Portsmouth and a generous pension, which did little to ease concerns about foreign interference. What made Charles II unique was how unapologetic he was about all of it. He acknowledged his illegitimate children more than a dozen and placed many in noble households. His mistresses were honoured, painted, and immortalised in court pageantry. Parliament groaned, Puritans wailed. But Charles grinned through it all. "I am the king," he once reportedly said, "and I do as I please." And yet, beneath the revelry lay a deeper truth. Charles's flamboyant personal life was also political camouflage. His rule was fragile, surrounded by religious tension, economic strain, and fears of absolutism. By casting himself as a lovable rake rather than a tyrant, he disarmed his critics. The charm covered the cracks. But if Charles II made pleasure palatable, the next monarchs on our list would discover that not all marriages could be so easily disguised. Some scandals ignite more than whispers. They invite coups, bullets, and the kind of royal ending you can't laugh your way out of. Serbia's King Alexander Obrenović and Queen Draga. In the shadowed annals of Balkan monarchy, few royal unions ever burned so brightly or ended so violently as that of King Alexander I of Serbia and Queen Draga Masin. Their marriage wasn't just controversial, it was considered an outright insult to the crown, and in the end, it provoked not just gossip, but mutiny. Alexander ascended to the throne in 1889 after his father, King Milan, abdicated unexpectedly. He was only 13 years old, placed under a regency until he came of age. When he took full control of the throne in 1893, the young monarch initially enjoyed a period of cautious optimism. Serbia, a kingdom wedged uneasily between larger powers, needed stability. But what it got instead was a love story turned national crisis. Draga Masin was a widow, a former lady-in-waiting, and most scandalously 7 years older than the king. She was not of royal blood, nor from one of Serbia's aristocratic dynasties. By the rigid standards of 19th century monarchies, her background was anathema. When Alexander announced their engagement in 1900, the reaction was swift and visceral. Nobles resigned in protest. Parliament nearly rioted. His parents, both former royals, were mortified. But Alexander refused to bend. He married Draga anyway, installed her as queen, and began promoting her brother's 2 ineffectual men, whose sudden rise further angered the elite. The royal couple was inseparable, and rumours swirled that Draga exercised enormous influence over court appointments, policies, and even royal decrees. The most explosive rumour? That Draga was unable to bear children, and that she intended to persuade Alexander to name one of her brothers as heir. Whether true or not, the claim sent shockwaves through military and political circles. A Serbia ruled by Queen Draga's brother? To the army, it was unthinkable. What had started as an unconventional marriage became a full-blown constitutional crisis. And in 1903, it ended in a palace coup so brutal that it shocked Europe. A group of army officers known as the Black Hand, who would later play a role in events leading to World War I, stormed the royal palace. In the early hours of the 11th of June, King Alexander and Queen Draga were assassinated. The Obrenović dynasty ended in a pool of shattered loyalty, and a new royal house, the Karađorđević, was installed. But the lesson was clear. A monarch may love whom he chooses, but the crown doesn't always forgive. And while the Balkans wrestled with the fallout of a fatal romance, Bavaria had its own royal entanglement brewing, one not born in backroom politics or military anger, but on the stage. A dancer, a king, and the scandal that sparked riots. Bavaria's Ludwig I and Lola Montez. King Ludwig I of Bavaria was a patron of the arts, a lover of Greek architecture, and a ruler who genuinely believed culture could elevate the soul. But culture, as it turned out, could also unravel a monarchy, especially when personified by one woman, Lola Montez. Born Eliza Rosanna Gilbert in Ireland, Lola Montez fashioned herself into a Spanish dancer with a fiery temper and a backstory full of deliberate inaccuracies. She arrived in Munich in 1846, claiming aristocratic lineage and performing in extravagant flamenco shows that left the Bavarian court scandalized and intrigued. Ludwig, in his 60s and already developing a reputation for eccentric tastes, was immediately captivated. Lola wasn't just beautiful, she was fearless. She challenged conservative norms, smoked cigars in public, and once reportedly horsewhipped an editor who criticized her. To Ludwig, she was thrilling, a symbol of everything courtly etiquette tried to suppress. He made her his official mistress. She received a noble title, Countess of Landsfeld, and took up residence near the royal palace. The king began writing poetry in her honor, commissioning paintings, and using state funds to support her lavish lifestyle. The public reaction? Absolute uproar. Bavaria was Catholic, traditional, and already simmering with revolutionary fervor. To the people, Lola Montez represented everything that had gone wrong. Foreign influence, moral decay, and royal detachment from the common citizen. Protests erupted. Students and intellectuals, already critical of Ludwig's autocratic tendencies, now had a living symbol to rally against. Worse, Lola wasn't content to simply enjoy her status, she interfered in politics. She lobbied for university professors to be fired, demanded enemies be exiled, and openly challenged anyone who opposed her. Her influence over Ludwig became not just scandalous but dangerous. By 1848, the backlash reached its peak. Europe was engulfed in revolutions, and Bavaria was no exception. Facing massive protests and fearing for his life, Ludwig abdicated in favor of his son, Maximilian II. Lola fled Munich amid jeers and rotten produce. Her later life would be just as colorful. She toured America, performed on stage, and eventually died in poverty. But her time in Bavaria remains a case study in how one woman and one royal's obsession can ignite a political firestorm. Ludwig, for his part, spent his remaining years writing melancholic verse and reflecting on the downfall his heart had brought him. Yet, for all the disasters these royal affairs brought down upon thrones, not all scandals ended in revolutions or riots. Some simply simmered until the paper trail caught up. And when a bundle of stolen love letters hit the British tabloids, even the most reserved princess couldn't keep her private life entirely sealed. Princess Anne and Commander Timothy Lawrence. The British royal family has always preferred its scandals neat, well-dressed, and ideally forgotten. But in 1989, a leak out of Buckingham Palace shattered that illusion, delivering a rare glimpse into the personal life of one of the more reserved Windsors, Princess Anne. The only daughter of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Anne had always been seen as the no-nonsense royal. Blunt, Athletic, fiercely independent, and respected for her charity work, she lacked the tabloid sparkle of her brothers, but perhaps that's why the 1989 affair caused such a stir. At the time, Anne was still married to Captain Mark Phillips, with whom she shared 2 children and an increasingly strained relationship. Rumours of unhappiness had circulated for years, but there was no public fallout until the letters surfaced. They were addressed to Anne, and reportedly written by Commander Timothy Lawrence, a naval officer serving as an equerry to the Queen. The letters were private, intimate, and deeply personal, although their exact contents were never released publicly. Somehow, they were stolen from the palace and delivered to the Sun newspaper, which, in a rare moment of restraint, handed them over to Scotland Yard rather than printing them. But the damage was done. The press exploded with speculation. Royal insiders scrambled to spin. The palace issued the barest of confirmations. The letters were private, personal, and had been stolen. Anne, true to form, said nothing. In 1992, she and Mark Phillips officially divorced. Later that same year, Anne married Timothy Lawrence in a quiet ceremony in Scotland, far from the glare of London tabloids. It was the first remarriage of a divorced royal since Princess Victoria Melita decades earlier, and though no grand scandal erupted from the union itself, the affair marked a turning point. It reminded the public that even the most stoic royals have private lives, and that love unsanctioned, inconvenient, or stolen could still rattle the gates of Buckingham Palace. Anne and Timothy have remained together ever since, living largely outside the royal spotlight. They've never spoken publicly about the affair, the letters, or the media circus that followed. But in a monarchy obsessed with image control, that leak showed how even iron discipline couldn't stop a few pages of ink from setting the whole palace whispering. And as we reach the end of our parade of royal indiscretions, we return to Portugal, to a story of love, betrayal, and legacy, so enduring, it became legend. Because some royal scandals don't just survive the court, they outlive the dynasty. Portugal's Pedro I and Inês de Castro. Every court has its scandal, but some scandals cross the line into legend retold in ballads, carved into stone, and romanticized beyond recognition. The story of Pedro I of Portugal and Inês de Castro is one of those tales. A royal love affair so incendiary it sparked a civil war, shook the foundations of the crown, and gave rise to one of the most macabre posthumous gestures in European history. It began in the 14th century when young Prince Pedro, heir to the Portuguese throne, was married off as royal sons always were to a woman of acceptable political pedigree, Constanza Manuel of Castile. It was a typical dynastic match, arranged not for love, but for treaties and land. But in the shadows of the court, Pedro's affections drifted straight toward Constanza's lady-in-waiting, Inês de Castro. Inês wasn't just beautiful, she was intelligent, cultured, and most damningly, a Castilian noblewoman with family ties to powerful factions in Spain. This made her not just an unsuitable mistress, but a geopolitical liability. Still, Pedro and Inês pursued their relationship openly. Even after Constanza died in 1345, Pedro refused to marry anyone else. Instead, he brought Inês to court, where she lived with him as his partner, bore him several children, and incurred the unyielding wrath of his father, King Alfonso IV. The king saw disaster brewing. He feared that Inês's Castilian family would gain undue influence over Portuguese affairs through Pedro. Advisors warned that her children might lay claim to the throne, triggering a succession crisis. In a move that now reads like a tragic inevitability, Alfonso acted. In 1355, while Pedro was away, the king's council ordered Inês's execution. It was carried out swiftly, and in secrecy. When Pedro returned and learned what had happened, the royal court braced for fury, and they got it. Pedro erupted into rebellion, launching a civil war against his father. Though eventually reconciled before Alfonso's death, Pedro never forgave the men responsible for Inés's murder. When he became king in 1357, he took brutal revenge, tracking down her killers, having them executed in public, and, according to chroniclers, personally tearing out one man's heart. But Pedro wasn't finished. In one of the most infamous acts of posthumous reverence ever recorded, he declared that he and Inés had secretly married before her death, making her, by his claim, the rightful Queen of Portugal. To seal this twisted fairy tale, Pedro ordered her body exhumed, dressed in royal robes, seated on a throne, and if legend is to be believed, made the court kiss her hand in tribute. Whether this event happened exactly as told is debated by historians, but the myth had already cemented itself in the Portuguese psyche. Inés became known as the Dead Queen, and her tomb, placed opposite Pedro's in the Alcobaça monastery, was inscribed with the poetic intention that the two lovers would see each other again on Judgment Day. The story of Pedro and Inés endures not because it's romantic, but because it's unsettling. It forces us to ask, what is love when untethered from reason? What is justice when fused with obsession? And what does it mean for a king to crown a corpse? History doesn't answer. It just leaves the stone effigies facing each other in silence, daring us to interpret. And with that final tale, our long descent into royal scandal concludes not with a scandal hushed up, but with one immortalized in song, carved in marble, and kept alive by the eerie compulsion of a monarch who couldn't let go. Because sometimes the most unexplained mysteries in royalty aren't the ones they try to erase, but the ones they go to impossible lengths to preserve.